For any of you out there who have achieved a very high level of success, or for any of you out there who are looking to achieve the next level or a very high level of success, you have a very good understanding that it takes a lot of different things. You have to be dedicated. You have to be passionate and like what you do. And one of the things that you have to have is being resourceful. And to me, resourceful would be coming up with different ways to overcome difficulties within your pursuit or within your industry. And that is exactly what my guest today has done, or he did early on in his career, and he continues to do today, where he is always looking for things maybe not only inside the box of coaching and teaching, but also what can be beneficial to he and his students that might be outside the box of coaching. Early on, in 25 years ago, it was probably looked down upon by the so-called establishment that might have had some old school views on things. And as it was transitioning to the new school of thought, these things would have been what are common approaches today, or things that are in use, such as physiology, biomechanics, force plating and mapping. He was involved in a lot of these things over 2 decades ago, and it has really enhanced his coaching, and even more so has provided a lot of value to those that he works with, be they some of the top players in the world, or the beginners at his home club in Hamilton, Ontario. If you haven't figured it out yet, he is the 2019 Canadian PGA Teacher of the Year, and his name is Scott Cowx. I've been a huge fan of his for a very long time. Really enjoy following him on social media and his material. He has a great certification program that he teaches all around the world called Scott Cowx Certifications. Deals in all parts of the game so that coaches can understand not only what happens, but why it happens, and they're able to help their students improve at a much greater, faster rate and maintain that. We did a deep dive in a whole bunch of different things. This is a very long episode, and 3 hours blew by like it was 30 minutes. And we could have kept talking at least easily for another 3 hours, but it was getting late. I know I don't want his wife to hate me, and I haven't even met her yet. So you're really going to enjoy this, especially a lot of you golf geeks out there, or anyone that is looking to learn more about coaching and what the track, so to speak, is, or the following the career of a top level, one of the best in the world, PGA Tour coaches, from what got them involved in teaching, how they progressed, and how they got to where they are today. So please give a big Golf 360 welcome to my guest today, Canadian PGA Teacher of the Year, Mr. Scott Cowx. What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Golf 360 podcast. I'm the host, Pete Popovich. So you may be asking yourself, what is Golf 360? And Golf 360 is a show that was designed to introduce you to people associated with the game of golf to help you improve not only at your game, but also your life. Almost all of our guests are from within the industry in some way, shape, or form, but some of the guests we have are from outside the industry, and it mainly revolves around the business world, with a few others scattered in here and there. Now, all of the guests that we have a few things in common. 1, they all were highly successful and accomplished in their field. 2, each has something to pass along that will help you in your game and your life. And 3, they were all more than willing to give back by passing along the things that they use to help them in their career, and even some of the mistakes that they made so that others don't make them in their journey. So I hope you find listening to them as enjoyable as I did interviewing them, and that each and every one of you benefits from the information that they so willingly and graciously pass along. Hey everybody, I want to give a big shout out to a new sponsor of the Golf 360 podcast, and that's Affinity Wealth Management Group. We all work exceptionally hard for our money, and none of us can afford to let that fall into the dark abyss of the big box financial service firms and their jack of all trades and master of none mantra, which basically means you become a number within a cookie cutter model that's also often accompanied by massive fees. Your future deserves more than average returns and little attention. At Affinity Wealth Management, they ensure that your financial goals receive highly individualized, tailored attention from experts, not just advisors, who are in the industry to be great and not average. As a client of Affinity Wealth, you receive a customized solution to your customized life, keeping in mind your family's financial situation, values, and risk tolerance. Call Affinity Wealth today for a no-cost consultation with one of their experts at 724-754-8200. Again, that's 724-754-8200. Or you can also check them out on the web at www.affinitywealthmg.com. That's AFFINITYWEALTHMG.com. This podcast is brought to you in part by Just Thrive Probiotic. You may be surprised to learn that your digestive system is the key to creating and maintaining the quality of your physical, mental, and emotional health, and it's one of the body's most essential systems. That's why the majority of nutritionists today highly recommend probiotics as an indispensable nutritional supplement. As a discriminating consumer, you've probably been searching for a probiotic that is proven, potent, and effective, and you found it. Just Thrive is your best choice for maintaining a healthy lifestyle. Just Thrive Probiotic captures the power of hundreds of thousands of years of nature's design with a specialized bacillus strain formulation that guarantees survivability through the stomach and upper digestive system. Supports optimum gut health, digestive health, immune health, and delivers antioxidants. Great for adults, kids, and the whole family. Use promo code GOLF360 at www.thriveprobiotic.com for 10% off your order. Okay, I am here with one of Canada's top teachers. He was the Canadian PGA Teacher of the Year in 2019, Mr. Scott Cowx. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir. Great to be on the show, and I said love Hilton Head, so can't wait to come down and see you in person at some point.
I'm a big fan of your work, so I've been really excited to talk to you. I've watched you from afar for quite some time. We've never met in person, but hopefully now that there's more reasons for you to come down here, and that now we've been introduced, so to speak, hopefully we can meet. And I want to say congratulations, because you are the 50th episode of Golf 360. So of all the other accomplishments you have, you can always tell somebody you're the 50th episode on the podcast.
Yeah, perfect. Well, congratulations to you and your show. As we were just chit-chatting a minute ago. I mean, that's a real milestone, I said, to get past a certain point. So well done.
Thank you. One of the things I find fascinating about your coaching and teaching is your approach. And from my perspective, the fascination comes from two ways. One is that you have an exceptional amount of knowledge, an array, and it's not just pigeonholed in swing mechanics or even biomechanics. And your scientific approach, I wanted to ask you, was that by design, or are you just a naturally analytical person?
Great point. Honestly, I think it stems a little bit, just maybe I'll give you a little backstory on sort of the history. So basically, as a junior golfer, the club I was at never had a range. So, it was a muni. So you waited a long time to get off and tee off. And so kids, obviously at that age, we chip and putt. So we got really good with the short game, but none of us really swung very well. We just didn't have a range to sort of hone our skills. So we literally just played and chipped and putt. And there were an awful lot of great players, or really good players, that came out of our club, even though we didn't really have these swing mechanics. So when I decided that I was going to make golf, a career, I kind of, I really didn't get my first golf lesson until I was 21 years old. I saved up all my shekels, and I went down and saw David Ledbetter in 1995 at Lake Nona. And, I thought, well, in 1995, David Ledbetter was the number one coach in the world, so I'm going to go take lessons from the number one coach in the world. And this was very, very early. I just turned pro, and legitimately, I was probably a 1 or a 2 handicap. I was a decent player, but I certainly wasn't sort of going to burn up the tour anytime soon. So I wanted to get a lot better. And when I started to play more pro events, I recognized that my ball striking skills were certainly lacking compared to a lot of the players I played with. And so anyways, I went and took a week of lessons with David, and Brian Mogg was actually the lead instructor at the time. And, really overhauled a lot of things, and I came away from that a much, much better player. And so certainly as a young assistant in the PGA of Canada, I thought, okay, well, I'm going to teach everybody what David taught me. And sort of, at that time it was kind of the links and sort of the work that he had done with Nick Faldo and Nick Price in particular. And that was kind of the swing modeling, if you will. And I thought, well, if I just follow the rules here, it obviously worked for me, so it's got to work for everybody. And, very quickly learned that certainly wasn't the case. And, certainly as a young assistant, you're trying a lot of things, and certainly some players got better, some players didn't get better. And, but I mean, you've got to learn somewhere. So that kind of led me on to a bit of a search, if you will, because I wasn't content with that. I wanted to help everybody that kind of came through the door and wanted to work with me. So I started to investigate a lot more on the biomechanics side. I hooked up with Dr. Scott Cowx, who was at the University of Pittsburgh. And he had the very first biomechanics lab in North America. So this all predates TPI. He was testing players. He was testing strength and flexibility in the late 90s. He was doing pressure traces, believe it or not, in the late 90s. So a lot of the things that we take for granted now, he was doing, very, very early. Now, the problem is he had all this great data from over 200 tour players in his database, but he really wasn't a golfer. So it's kind of like, well, we're testing them. This is what we see. And one of the interesting things that came about was the professional golfer. The only physical difference between a professional golfer and everybody else walking around was basically hip strength. So the pro golfers were twice as strong in their pelvis and their hips as the average player or average person walking around.
Was that from? Is that from playing, or that's naturally and they gravitated toward that sport because they were better because of that?
Because I think it was more from the playing, is that there's an awful lot of stress, especially on glute medius and sort of the lateral components, shifting your weight over and over and over and over again, and you become very, very strong in the pelvic girdle. And so of all the testing he did with the players, that was really the only main difference that he saw. I said that they had grip strengths that ranged from incredibly strong to quite weak. They had shoulder strength that was all over the map, and obviously all these players were very, very good. So it was interesting going through that process. I learned a lot about the body, learned a lot about the biomechanics in working with him a little bit. And, so that kind of got me interested in some other parts of the biomechanics. I started to work a little bit with Chris Welch at Xenolink. Chris is in Endicott, New York, which is only about 3 hours or so away from Hamilton here. So I'd drive down and I'd see Chris and, stay for a few days, and we kind of talk about some things. And Chris was really the pioneer. I'd never heard of, ground reaction forces and things like that. And he was teaching that as early as 2000, 2001. I mean, very, very early. And again, it's just at the very early dates, the early adopters kind of didn't really know what to do with it. It's like, here's all this great stuff, but how does this really apply to squaring up the club face? Right? So it's taken a lot of time, literally probably 20 years to figure out how this stuff actually gets back to the golf club. And now you've got, obviously, Sasha McKenzie, you've got Dr. Kwan, you've got, Dr. Nesbitt, you've got, Mike Duffy, you've got Dr. Scott Lynn. You've got some really, really smart people now who are putting some of these things together and saying, yes, we're looking at this. How does ground reaction force actually get to the golf club? How do we deliver it? And 20 years ago, we just didn't really have that. So I learned a lot about biomechanics very early, and then, that really helped because I started to understand limitations of people's physique and what they could and could not do. And certainly I couldn't take, the average overweight 50-year-old male and get them to turn like Adam Scott or whatever it happened to be. There were going to be some limitations, but I needed to find a solution that was going to work for that 50-year-old member to play better golf. So from all that, over the years, it's sort of developed into me building sort of an anatomy model and understanding how different joint segments work and how they are applied and how that applies to the delivery of the golf club, so that I can take just about anybody's physique and get them to deliver the club better. Right. And late 2008, I think I went down to a Stocktonville camp with a couple of my colleagues here in Canada. And that was sort of very interesting because at the time it was, kind of the hot thing, if you will, on tour. And, the fellows had produced a few winners, Dean Wilson and a couple of other guys. Through that, I got to know Grant Waite, who, has become a good friend of mine for the last, 10 or 11 years. And, we've worked a lot on his swing together over the years, myself and Grant and Dana Dahlquist. And, that was sort of a real introduction into some really, really high level swings and really understanding some of the geometry pieces of Morad and some of Mac's stuff, and sort of having to tie that into the biomechanical models that I was sort of using. And it was really when I started to blend some of those things, I just saw a lot of correlations, the brilliance, if you will, of Mac O'Grady and some of the things that he was doing way back in the middle 80s. It's just astounding. And certainly we all owe him some gratitude in terms of what we teach today, because there are, aftershocks or tremors, if you will, that have come from all of that information. Being the trailblazer in the 80s, I mean, they called him Wacko O'Grady, like it was just way too much at that time. And now a lot of the knowledge that he had back then, we're applying every day in our lessons today. And this is, 30 plus years later.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really interesting. And I think the same thing too will happen as time goes by, is the things that we take for granted, or maybe the things that we learn now, we'll probably take for granted in 15 or 20 years. It seems like the clock is speeding up, every year. Now we're getting AI, we're getting all sorts of really cool stuff. We have gears, we have Enzo, we've got, the intricate sort of ability to see impact and how delivery is being affected. And as that becomes much more scalable and affordable, the coaches that embrace some of that are going to be incredibly well off. I mean, in terms of being able to help their students. And at the end of the day, that's what we're in the game of, is we're all in a helping mode, and we're trying to help these players obviously play better golf, whether they're a 30 handicap or whether they're a tour player. So I think for every young pro out there, I mean, it's really, really important to understand anatomy. And that's, in my certification courses, like I was saying earlier, we have just under 2,000 pros worldwide now certified in my coaching certifications. And we go through it. We go through joints. We go through how different joints move and how they should move and how that we can use those things to, deliver the club more efficiently and more consistently, no matter whether that player is heavyweight and not very flexible, or is a very supple junior who's looking to obviously excel in the game. So it's sort of been an amalgamation of all those things, the geometry, the biomechanics, the knowledge on the anatomy, if you will, that's sort of led me to where I am today. And certainly, I try and myself, I learn from other great instructors as well. And I think there's a better environment today than certainly when I turned pro 25 years ago. 25 years ago, guys would hold on to their secrets, right? They weren't willing to share. It was like my trade secret. I'm not gonna share it. And what I sense worldwide now is that everyone's trying to help each other, and they're realizing that if we all get a little bit better and we help, others play better golf, there's going to be more than enough business. There's going to be more than enough golfers out here for everybody. And, we're raising the level of the game by cooperating and helping and working together to help our players. And I'm really happy to know that, some of the things that I'm telling some of my coaches in Thailand or Scotland or Sweden is being passed on to students that go on and win tournaments. And, there's a few students now on the European Tour that I started to work with, through some other coaches in Denmark and so on, 5 or 6 years ago. And they're now playing the European Tour. So that kind of stuff, no, I certainly am not taking credit for it. I mean, the real credit is the player and obviously the coach there. But, there might be just a little shred of information that was used at some time to maybe, push that player a little bit forward.
I give you all the credit in the world, because when you went down, I mean, to me, and going back to that era, when you went to University of Pittsburgh and sought that out, I mean, to me, that was almost, in that time in the industry, as you mentioned, that coaches would keep things to themselves, and anything really that delved outside of the traditional way of teaching back then was almost frowned upon or poo-pooed upon, to use a kind of a politically correct statement on a family show like this. But so I mean that you went out and sought that is very impressive, because to me it went against the grain at a time when most people weren't seeking out that type of information. So what was it that was there just a chance meeting, or what was it that led you to seek out a biomechanics specialist and delve into that segment?
Well, actually, really, yeah, exactly. And one of the neat things, we can all thank Tiger Woods, because with Tiger's, introduction into the golf world in 96 or 97 there, and really bringing a whole lot of attention to golf, because at the time, golf wasn't well researched. It wasn't well funded, if you will, in terms of research. And what Tiger brought to it was a sense of cool, but he also has brought a ton of money into the game. And as a result, obviously the players play for purses now simply because of that Tiger Woods effect, and sort of enjoy the livings that they do now. But also from a golf research standpoint, the scientists kind of looked at this, and the scientists that were looking at the Olympic sports and so on were like, hey, there's an opportunity here. Nobody's really looked at golf swings really, really well. And so all of a sudden, there was a whole influx of really, really smart people that was looking at other sports and basically telling the golf pros, it's like, yeah, you guys think this is what's happening, but in reality, it's not really what's happening. This is actually what's happening. And, there were two modes of thought with that. It was either, well, I'm just, I'm not going to believe the scientists and I'm going to go about my way, or it's like, oh, that's interesting. And how can I apply that perhaps to my teaching? And so very early on, it was always like that. It was kind of like, okay, I've got this information I've gotten from the scientists here, and I've got to decide, is this applicable to what I'm trying to do? Is it just a point of interest, and it's interesting, but it really has no sort of effect on what I'm going to do? Or maybe I'll shelve this and think about this for a while and let this permeate a little bit and see if it's going to do anything. And so I would say I'm guilty of being a voracious reader. I've read just about everything and every instruction book. And as a kid, I had every Golf Digest and Golf magazine from, sort of mid-'80s all the way through. And so it was just a very, very big sponge. And basically when the sponge dried out and I wasn't happy with that information, it's like, well, listen, these people aren't getting better. And frankly, I mean, selfishly, you're also looking to improve your own game. And, David got my game to a much higher level, but I still wanted to play even more. He got me probably to a +2 with the instruction that I did, and the swing changes I made kind of probably brought my scores down another 3 strokes, and I started to win the odd pro events and started to play better golf. And so, okay, what's the next step? Well, how do I get to play, some tour events or some, Nike Tour at the time was back then. So I had to get better, and really it was kind of like, well, if I'm going to get better, I need more information, And so you start to go outside of the normal realm, and you start to sort of, talk to some different people that aren't maybe necessarily golfers firstly, but they have an interest in the sport, and that's guys like Chris Welch and Dr. Scott Leppard and some of these people that I talked to in the early days. We also had there's a chiropractor in Toronto named Sean Fletch, and Sean Fletch was the original partner of Dr. Greg Rose. So they were doing something that was called Swing Link, I believe, and this is again around the year 2000. And they were doing courses basically on biomechanics and body and things like that to give golf pros a bit of a starter program on anatomy and biomechanics. And they were running this thing with Dr. Greg Rose. Dr. Greg Rose at the time was in Washington, D.C., and he had a chain of chiropractor, outfits in that area. And he had partnered up with this Sean Fletch. And anyways, whatever happened, that arrangement ended, and then very quickly after that, he started TPI with Dave
Phillips. Dave Phillips.
Thank you, David Phillips.
Mm-hmm.
And so they started TPI, obviously sponsored by Titleist. But a lot of the early stuff, especially in TPI, was actually exactly the same as the Swing Link stuff. And that's how I got a hold of Chris Welch, because he was friends with Sean Fletch. And so it was just sort of a chain reaction. I wanted to know more, so I contacted Chris and said, hey, could I come and see you? And I want to talk about some stuff. And, you know, he was very much into movement patterns and ground reaction forces and how to improve player sequencing. And, you know, he's bridged that into doing that with all sports. So he does lacrosse and baseball, and those, I think, at this point in his career are probably bigger sort of contracts, if you will, than the golf industry. But a lot of the foundational stuff, you know, I certainly learned from Dr. Sean Fletch and Chris Welch. And so anyways, it was really interesting to see that progression. And over time, I said, okay, so now I know the human body, but I still need to understand delivery. And all of a sudden we got TrackMan and B-Plane, and, you know, so how do I tie all that in? And we talked about the 3D delivery of the golf club. And, okay, so I need to know some stuff about geometry and angles and overtaking rates and rate of closure and all these kind of fun terminologies. And, you know, how do I influence that is basically the biggest thing. So I've got all this information. Now, how use the body to either, a lot of players slow down rate of closure, speed up rate of closure, you know, whatever it happens to be, so I can hopefully help this player hit the ball longer and straighter. So I started to do some things online around maybe 2010. I was probably on Facebook in 2010. I really didn't get into Instagram and that stuff until I think 2015 or 16. So that was kind of late, but I started to be on some of the forums and so on Facebook, I think going back to about 2010. And there were a lot of like-minded pros that would just kind of hash stuff out, and we'd all argue and so on. And but, you know, we all kind of learned, too, a little bit from each other. At least got you thinking about different things, and that was kind of cool. And then, you know, unfortunately, the Facebook forums kind of implode, because when you get like 5,000 people in there, and there's such a difference in education in there, it just becomes just a war of words and people yelling at each other, and so it doesn't become productive. So then all the forums kind of branch off into smaller forums again, right? So over time, you know, then it became a golf biomechanics forum, and then that one grew to 2,000 or 3,000. And now it's like, so once they grow to that size, it just becomes sort of counterproductive. You're spending too much time, you know, reading people's rants, basically, and there's no real information. So, but anyways, from all of that, I suddenly get a little bit of contact with some pros in Europe, and pro in Denmark, and Kenneth Hansen and Rasmus Rolleged contacted me, and they said, listen, you know, we're this is 2015. And he said, we're not happy with what our PGA is doing. We're running our own coach camp, basically, just like you did, just like Jason's done, just like obviously Andrew Rice has done. And, you know, we're going to invite some people to talk, and we're going to learn some stuff, because we're not learning much from our own association. Would you be interested in coming over and giving a presentation? I was like, wow, okay, this is crazy.
The power of social media.
So literally, absolutely, and I can certainly, you know, take a lot of the credit in my career for sure, for being, you know, very much a part of that. And so now all of a sudden I had all this information that's been floating around in my head permeating for the last 20 years or whatever as a golf pro, and I'm applying it every day. But now I actually have to create some presentations and organize some information. So that was the very first Scott Cowx Certified instructional series. Was I flew to Denmark, and they hosted me for 2 or 3 days, and we went into some great detail on a lot of anatomy pieces. And from there, it honestly just snowballed, and I came back to Canada, and I had requests to come to Sweden and the UK and Germany, and all of a sudden it was like, wow, okay, all right, I'll come back in the spring, and I'll arrange a little 4-country tour here. And so I did that, and I came back, and the next time they said, well, we want you to come to you know, a few other places as well. We're going to do one in Scotland, we're going to do one in Norway as well. And so anyway, so it sort of snowballed, and for whatever reason, I was very popular with some of the pros in Scandinavia, kind of Norway, Denmark, Sweden in particular. and was having weekly contact with a lot of these pros, and we discuss things and talk about things. And at one point, I had my own little forum on Facebook, and we would talk about swings and throw some things out there. And honestly, it just got way too busy. I just couldn't do that anymore. So it was a lot of fun, and it kind of snowballed. And then all of a sudden, I got a request to go, and Jason was actually one of the first guys to get me to the U.S. And I went down and started to do some of my certifications in the U.S. And I have a U.S. visa, and so I was sort of able to kind of do that. And also my player on the PGA Tour, Mackenzie Hughes, lived in Charlotte, so it was a nice easy fit for me to go down and spend some time with Jason at Carmel. And we arranged one there, and arranged one up in Raleigh, and a couple of other places. So all of a sudden it was sort of popping up, and I started to go out west in Canada and to Vancouver and do some out there, and it just kind of grew, and to the point I was like, wow, this is kind of fun. And I try and arrange this at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year, when the core season I wasn't teaching as much, and it was just a great way to start the year and end the year. And as I said, certainly that grew and grew for 3 or 4 years, and then sort of COVID hit, and I was like, okay, well, now what do you do? Can't travel, so I'm going to have to become an expert in Zoom here. So we start to get these Zoom classes going on, and I thought, it'd be kind of fun if I can do some of these and get some interest. And at that point, it really snowballed, because now all of a sudden I was getting Thailand, Australia, Japan, Korea, places that I'd never been before, and they were obviously following me on social media, and they were like, yeah, this is great, we want to learn more. And so that's really, at least from the coach certification side, what I've been up to the last year and a half or so. And as well as certainly my own clients and my role at the club level, and teaching our members, and teaching juniors, and developing players and national team players, and pros basically all over the world. So it's been very busy, but at the same time extremely enjoyable at sort of 48 years old to have all these little sort of dibbly-dabbly things that I can do, as opposed to just one thing. And that's been the nicest part of all, is just having the ability to, in Canada, obviously we have an off season. So in that off season, I used to not really have much revenue, and we teach a little bit indoors, but it was really a down time of the year. And now I've got the ability to travel or do some more of the online, and really make it sort of a 12 months a job for sure.
Yeah, being diversified, it makes it, I've found out with the podcast and coaching, and I was very late to the YouTube and the social media game, so I'm still working on that. But I think it keeps, at least for me, it keeps you young, if that's a very generic way to say it, right? Because you're not always doing the same thing, and you just get in a rut and you get worn out, right? You can put the teaching away and go do something else. You mentioned your travel and doing the certifications around the world. For me, it's getting away and doing the podcast. And I'm sure other people have other things, but I think that's one of the best things that social media and tech in general of the era that we're in has allowed people to do. It's you can cut out the middleman, for better or for worse, and become your own producer and your own technical advisor and actor, so to speak. And you can control the whole process, which gives you more control over your own life. You can pick and choose more. But it tends to lead a lot of us in a lot of different directions. And as you said, you get a little busy, and sometimes you have to weigh which one is going to be better for you and the people you're working with. Like you said, you had to leave the Facebook forum that you had just because it got too cumbersome to manage.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things where, I think there's a time and place, and there's an evolution. It's a continual evolution. And Instagram was a huge deal, because, when you first started to do it, it was like the perfect, 15 seconds was the perfect time for a slow motion swing video. So it was like the perfect, you couldn't design a better sort of vehicle for golf pros, in terms of delivering this content. And the fact that, you could key in and hashtag golf swing and stuff would come up, and it's just the whole way that kind of worked. It was like, wow, we can reach people that we would never in a million years reach, because they're out there searching for this information. And obviously we can put up those hashtags, and we can put up things like that, and we can have people follow us. And early on, it was, at the end of the day, you also need to monetize it, right? Is how do you turn that back into something that's obviously monetized? And early on, one of the things I did was offer, like a lot of golf pros do, and, they'd send me videos, we do an analysis, we talk about it, I give them a little 15-minute video of what they need to do and why, and send it back, and, charge X amount for that service. Well, what I found was that about 1% of, 1% of my followers would sort of request something like this. So, the other 99% were trolling through what I was doing, but 1% of those people were getting in contact with me and saying, listen, can you look at my swing? I was like, wow, okay, well, this is a new business model I haven't really thought about. All right. So that kind of evolved into some things, and I did that for a while. And truthfully, that, because of the time it took to do these analysis and send them back and have the back and forth contacts a little bit, it was just too much. So, with Zoom, with COVID, it all of a sudden became, well, I'm going to do online lessons now. You're going to put up your phone on the range, and I'm going to give you a lesson. And, at first I was a little bit wary. I was like, how effective can this really be, me doing this? And I was very pleasantly surprised. I think it's as much as 80 to 85% of the quality of an in-person lesson. But there is a certain demographic or a certain client there that it works really well for. So you're a low handicapper with a pretty high golf IQ, knows the lingo, knows the language a little bit. Certainly those people were easier to work with online. So I would say most of my online clients would be 5 handicap or better. I do have a couple of 12 and 15 handicappers, but they're kind of your golf nerds. They read a lot. They know the lingo. They follow, Dana. They follow George Gankus. They follow, all the people that everybody else is following, and they sort of get some of the concepts. So it becomes a lot of fun. And so we kind of do a live lesson, and on Zoom, it's all recorded. So, we send them the copy of the recording afterward, and which is great. So they've got me for that hour, but now there's not a lot of sort of after lesson time that I have to sort of deal with. So I can then apply that to either other lessons or obviously other parts of my business. So that's been a great thing, just to be able to use Zoom in that context, as well as the platform for my coach certifications.
Yeah, it's a booming time. I know a lot of people are saying, they say it's got too much, and people are on their phones all the time, which is, that's the negative side of it. But as you just illustrated and talked about, there's a lot of people who are doing a lot of good things, utilizing the right way to help people in the best way that they can. And I think that's the best part of it. That kind of was the genesis or the thought process of this podcast was, as we talked about before we came on, it's like, I know a lot of these people who the general public might not know about. Why don't I have a podcast? Or it seemed to be the way to get them introduced to people, not only to help their game, but to help them in life. For example, I had Mark Silvers on. Mark used to play the Corn Ferry Tour. He played Mackenzie. Yep. He won up there. I don't know if you know Mark, but great guy, and he's from Savannah. We were talking about that, and amongst other things, and it's just amazing how it kind of evolves. And just,
you kind of don't know quite where it's going to end up. To be honest with you, like it starts in one place and it continues evolving. And as you said, if you're sort of somewhat up on the social media end of it and some of these platforms, as you said, we're all getting extremely good at digital media to a large extent. And as you said, we're able to create our own content and cut out the middleman, if you will, and be able to do some pretty high quality stuff with some basic skill sets because of the powerful, tools that we're using like Zoom and some of the, video editing and sound editing software and so on. we basically are becoming our own producers. And, you know, one of my good friends in the industry, you know, Ian Fraser at TXG, you know, he's very widely followed on the club fitting side of the game. And, you know, it's very interesting to have conversations with him and how that business has evolved from, you know, not just YouTube, but then, you know, private YouTube channels and you know, obviously social media, and really pushing his follower base now is close to, I think, almost 200,000 followers. And,
Jeez, that's pretty good.
And this is, you know, we're talking about golf clubs. We're talking about shafts. We're talking about, you know, stuff for years and years that was kind of boring to a lot of people. And people are really excited about it, you know, and so you're able to create some really good educational entertainment value out of what previously would have been a very dry subject. You know, certainly when we took our club fitting courses as young apprentices, it was like, oh my goodness, when is this going to be over? You stick the epoxy in the shaft and you stick it in the head, and there you go. That's all we need to do. Obviously, it's a lot more in depth than that, certainly now, and the tools that they use to, you know, certainly properly club fit, et cetera. But so I think, you know, pros then embrace that, and sort of the industry embraces that. We're able to, you know, reach people. I've got a great client of mine that's in India. You know, just obviously the time zones, whatever it is, 14 hours different or something like that. And, you know, we have conversations. I give them golf lessons in India.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Unbelievable stuff. Absolutely. And it's only going to get better, you know, as the technology gets better, as the connections get better, in particular, you know, with the phone and the 5G and all the rest of that. You will be able to do, you know, sort of face-to-face meetings with people that are live all over the world. And that's, you know, we see it changing businesses, obviously, and how many businesses are abandoning the brick and mortar sort of setup for their businesses and going into a more versatile, you know, sort of at home or / partly at home business model. And that's going to save them, you know, millions and billions of dollars over the course of things. So, you know, as we are able to connect with people better and better and better like this, you know, golf's obviously just one of many things. You know, doctors are doing remote surgery from thousands of miles away with the help of the same technologies, which is unbelievable. I mean, just absolutely unbelievable. Someone could save your life from 1,000 miles away by doing basically a surgery online. Just boggles your mind how powerful that is.
You know, I might be simplistic, but I still marvel at that you can be in one part of the world in one part of the day, get on an airplane, and be in another part of the world in the same day. I mean, that might be a little simplistic, but to me, it's kind of like a very generic version of a time machine, especially once you start crossing time zones and everything. As I'm sure you've done plenty, right? It's just very, for example, you know, you can be in Hamilton where you are in Canada, and then what's it take you to get to Florida? 3 or 4 or 5 hours in a plane, and you're
not even. No, I mean, you can take a direct flight. You can be in Orlando in 2.5.
Right, so 2.5 hours, and you're in Florida, which is for anybody who has ever been to Canada or Florida, you know, there's quite a bit of difference in the two.
Absolutely. Well, the funny thing is, it takes 5 hours or 6 hours to fly across Canada, but it only takes 2.5 to get to Florida. So that's how wide Canada is. But no, and the interesting thing is when you start talking, you know, just the mobility of the whole thing is just the other day, you know, I did a lesson in Sweden and then followed up with a lesson in the UK, followed by a lesson in Ireland, followed by a lesson in Scottsdale, followed by a lesson in Vancouver, back to Sweden, and then I had actually a local lesson in Toronto, and that was all online. You know, in the space of, you know, 7 hours, had literally jumped continents, you know, all over the place. So it's so humbling to a certain extent. It's like, wow, you know, like, this is amazing that you can reach people and help people with their game, you know, literally all over the world, just with a good connection.
You know, one thing I want to ask you about that Silver and I were talking about, and I've talked about this with a couple other, like Scott Perrell's been on, Todd Behringer, Tim O'Neill.
Yep.
How hard professional golf can be. And really, when those guys were on, I wanted to try to illustrate to the listener that tour pros, and I'm bringing this up to you because you've worked with a number of them and elite players. Tour pros go through the same human emotions of fear, anxiety, excitement that the average Joe 20 handicapper goes through. It's just at a different level, and that doubt and things like that creep in to their games and can wreak havoc. And then something small can turn them around, just the same way that your average golfer at your country club might shoot their career low round one day and come back next week and they can't break 100. And it's interesting to see that dynamic. But along those lines, what, in your opinion, you take a guy like Jordan Spieth, who's now out of his, so if you want to call it a slump, and then we're also watching a guy like Rory who's in the midst of trying to come out of some play that's not Rory like. What do you think it is that at the elite level, players will go from looking like they can hit any shot anytime and everything is just automatic to where they're looking down the fairway and they're like, I hope this golf ball stays in the golf course?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fine line. And you're right. At any moment, you can kind of cross that line and crash the bus, if you will. And one of the tour players I worked with, once said to me, you're one swing away from putting it in the hole and you're one swing away from hitting it out of bounds. And you kind of have to just be okay with that. The second that you're not okay with that is really where you start to create a lot of problems, because we're all human beings. We're going to hit bad shots. There's going to be moisture on the ball. There's going to be mud on the ball. There's going to be all sorts of situational things that you cannot control the outcome of where that ball ends up, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of times you have to bring it back to the level is, what can I actually control, right? And I can control myself to a certain extent. I can control the club to a certain extent. I can control what I'm doing with that club to a certain extent. But that's where my focus needs to be. And when we start to drift away from that, and certainly we start to get into the results-oriented thinking, okay, I've got to make a birdie here to make the cut, or I've got to, I don't make double, which is usually it's a negative, or don't hit it out of bounds. Like, then all of a sudden I'm dealing with things that I really can't control. It's like worrying about in life things that are really out of your control. Maybe tomorrow the sky falls and that's the end of the earth and humanity as we know it. I can worry about that, but, realistically, there's probably not a very good chance of that happening, right? So to answer your question a little bit, it's a lot of it is certainly mental, and a lot of it's outlook oriented, and a lot of it is simply the abilities of the player to kind of absorb the body blows, if you will, that golf throws at you. And, the good players are very resilient. They understand there will be periods of bad play, and they will also understand there will be periods of absolutely phenomenal play. And hopefully we can string together those weeks that you're playing really well and translate that into some good productive weeks. But I tell, all my tour players, I mean, Tiger Woods is the most winningest golfer of all time. Across his entire career, he's won almost 20% of all the tour events he's ever played. Okay? Unbelievable. Except he's lost 80% of them.
Right. Could you imagine a major league baller? They're only batting 200. They're not going to be in the big leagues very long.
Exactly. So when you look at it that percentage, here's the best golfer that's ever played the game, and he loses 80% of the time he tees it on. Right? And this is, in his prime was a plus 9.8 index. Just absolutely phenomenal. The best player in the world right now is around a plus 7.5 index. So literally 2 shots better than the very, very best that is playing the game right now. Right? Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. So statistically, is Tiger going to win a lot? Absolutely. He's the best player. Absolutely. But he's still going to lose a lot of the time because he can't control the outcomes of everybody else's shots. And some people are going to have good weeks and they're going to beat you. And certainly Tiger's good enough that, he's going to win a lot of those events as well. So it's just a game, and in terms of understanding those odds. And at the end of it, you really, you don't know if you go to the casino, if you're going to walk out with $500, you're going to drop $500.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Doesn't mean you stop playing though. Right? And that's kind of the mentality of the best players that I've worked with. kind of have. It's like, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to try. I'm going to prepare. I'm going to do all these things. And if I miss a cut, I miss a cut. And if I play well, I'm going to play well. But I can't really predict what the outcome of this week is going to be. I can only prepare for it. So when the focus is on preparation, when the focus is on process, you've got a much better chance, if you will, of staying in the moment and not getting ahead of yourself and getting results oriented. So it doesn't do these players any justice when, somebody puts a microphone in Jordan Spieth's face or Rory McIlroy's face and say, "Hey, you're really struggling." It's like, well, thanks, buddy. I know I'm struggling.
Right.
You don't need to remind me.
Thanks,
Right?
Captain Obvious.
Yeah, exactly. Captain Obvious are right there. So as a result, it's like, well, now, in a way, like if enough people keep asking you this, well, now you start to convince yourself that there's something wrong. Right? And it almost plays out that way. It's almost like, okay, well, now you're not thinking about the process anymore. Now you're not thinking about what you can actually control. You're now worried about what everybody else is thinking. And you're now historically going back in your mind and going, please don't be another David Duval. Please don't be any Ian Baker Finch.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? And now we have thoughts of this instead of positive thoughts of, hey, let's go ahead and try and be the best player I can, or try and do the best that I can. And especially in this, I think you'll have less of that nowadays because the stats are so good on tour now. You can very quickly see which parts of your game do not measure up to everybody else's. 20 years ago when you didn't have ShotLink data, it was like, yeah, I played good or I played bad. And there was no, why is this guy winning and I'm not, right? There was no sort of discernible reason. Well, you can look at every single stat under the sun now on ShotLink and actually see, yeah, you know what? I'm not a very good bunker player statistically compared to everybody else out here, so maybe I should work on my bunker game. So it's not rocket science in terms of what things you need to do to get better. And, even 2 years ago, I remember a press conference interview with Rory, and Rory was talking about he wanted his strokes gained to be +3. +3.1 was kind of the number, because he figured if he was +3.1 on strokes gained over the average tour player, he was going to win, 6 times a year or something like that. And, that year I think it was +2.7 is kind of where the strokes gained on the entire day. Rory gains normally a ton off the tee every single day that he tees it up. So if he just putts and chips putts and wedges halfway decent, he typically can blow the field away. In 2019, he won at Hamilton, my old home course. Won the Canadian Open, shot 63, 61, or something like that on the weekend. Just absolutely tore, won 64, 61, I think, on the weekend. Just absolutely tore the golf course apart and won by 7 or 8 shots. And it just happened to be, he loved the greens for whatever reason. He putted really well that week, combined with the way that he drives the golf ball, and you can throw it on the green from half the places he was driving. So, Rory will be back. Obviously, Jordan's back and sort of kind of combated some things. And sometimes it might take a little different perspective. But if you really look at what, Jordan's done, whether it was with Butch Harmon or getting a second sort of point of view, if you will, from Butch Harmon, what did that really do? Well, that got Jordan focusing on the things that Jordan can control. So now all of a sudden, by changing coaches or taking a little bit different perspective, that got him back working on the things that Jordan can actually control. Right? And that's why sometimes there are coaching changes. Like nobody knows really obviously what Butch was telling him, but it might have been just a slightly different message than Cameron was giving him. And, I know Cameron fairly well, and he's a great coach, and but sometimes it's just that change of environment. All of a sudden, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to focus on this instead. So Jordan's way too good, just way, way too good to really be in a slump forever. And same with Rory. I mean, they are measurably better than the average tour player. So when they slump, they actually don't even slump typically to the level of the average tour player. They're still above average, even they're just not, top 5 in the world. When you start looking at the statistics of it all. So, but in my opinion, the psychology of what he did by going to Butch simply got him back on the process as opposed to the result. And now working on the things that he could control. And it's all about little battles, you know. Maybe I work on my putting and I putt a little bit better. Okay, that's one thing I can tick off. And okay, now my driver's a little bit better. Okay, I can tick that off. And next thing you know, we start to, you know, shoot some decent numbers, and we go out there and play in our practice rounds, and we start to see some different things. And next thing you know, obviously the confidence grows. But in reality, it's just the fact that he was able to put himself back into the process than anything else.
Yeah, and you hear Tiger talk about that all the time. Even when he was going through his swing changes and then he had his chipping issues, he would repeat over and over in all his interviews, it's the process. And I mean, of all the great things that Tiger did, his swing and the physical aspects, the mental is second to none, especially with the winning the Masters and coming back from the back trouble and if there's anybody that's going to come back from the leg issues he has now, I don't think anybody's counting him out. In fact, there probably more people are expecting him to come back, and I think golf needs that.
I would say capacity. Obviously, nobody beats Father Time forever, but you know, in terms of he's done an awful lot of damage to his body in different ways over the years, and physically, but his experience level and his ability to, you know, not only, I mean, he doesn't get enough credit for you know, the strategist, if you will, that he is.
Mm-hmm.
And just like Jack Nicklaus, I mean, nobody, you know, takes apart a golf course, you know, better than Tiger Woods with his irons. You know, he knows so well and the other pros marvel about it, his ability to control the distance, the ability to hit the right shot, you know, to hit the high fade or the low draw and really play the game. And, you know, other tour players just marvel at that, and you know, so he's taken the raw speed and power and so on that he used to overpower golf courses, obviously early in his career. He's replaced that with a much more mature game, but he's now become, you know, one of the best strategists, if you will, of all time, and he certainly won the Masters in 2014 partially for that. And obviously he's been around that place enough times to know where to hit it and where not to hit it, and he just did a masterful job of that over the 4 days. And
mm-hmm.
I mean, I certainly was shocked. I was certainly surprised. I mean, I didn't think after the injuries and so on that he would ever be in contention again. I figured he might win a tournament, but not a major for certain. And for him to do that, I think is one of the coolest things that sport that we've ever seen.
Right.
Still, Mickelson winning the PGA at 50 years old. I mean, incredibly inspiring for us guys that are getting close to that age. That, you know, he's bombing it past Koepka. He's bombing it past, you know, half the guys he's playing.
That was pretty impressive.
You know, and he's using a 47.5-inch driver, so yeah, he's got some technology on his, you know, that he's using there to help him do it. But just the way that, again, he played it incredibly strategic last Saturday and Sunday rounds. I mean, if you go through them, he missed it generally in the right places and hit a lot of really good quality shots, and obviously made a couple of you know, Phil Mickelson's holing out from the bunker, et cetera, that he typically throws into the typical week. And it was just awesome to watch. I mean, that was probably the most enjoyable PGA I've seen this year. Just because there were so many storylines in the golf course with such a route, and obviously you had guys like Koepka and Ustays and stuff that were playing really well. Phil held them all off.
Mm-hmm. Is this, you've mentioned you used to read and are a voracious reader still and get your hands on a lot of things, and you're a student of the game. Why do you think it is that so many great ball strikers have played a fade off the tee? You know, you take Hogan and Nicklaus and Tiger, and then a lot of people are familiar with the DJ story where Butch wanted him to go to a fade, and you know, he did finally, and he shot 61 2 days in a row at home, and he's been playing a fade ever since. Well, from a technical perspective and from a student of the game perspective, what is your opinion, or not opinion, but why do you think that some of the better players hit fades in particular off the tee?
Yeah, exactly, and you know, two reasons really. I mean, generally, you know, because of the fade being to the right of your swing direction. right? Mm-hmm. The face is to the right of your swing direction. As a result, you're creating a little bit more height and a little bit more spin. So for players that are long enough, that ball is going to land softer in the fairway. So it's not going to pound down the fairway like a hard draw will. So it might not be quite as long, but from a control perspective, there are certainly some advantages to that. One of the things that I think, just as a quick aside, an interesting stat for the average tour player, okay, to get the same proximity out of the rough as they do out of the fairway, they have to hit the ball 50 yards further.
50?
50.
Whew.
Okay. The best players in the world, the top 25 players in the world, need to hit it 25 yards further. So you need to hit the fairway because then you can control the spin, you can control that approach shot. So you need to hit it 50 yards further. So if your average approach is 150 yards, your proximity as a fairway from 150 is basically the same as 100 yards out of the rough. So when we talk about drive, bomb and gouge and all the rest of that, it's not quite that true, okay? Now, obviously, if I hit the fairway and I'm 30 yards ahead, well, that's great. But I need to put a premium on putting in the fairway because at the end of the day, it's proximity to the hole which matters most, right? So we kind of lose sight of that because obviously the whole industry is enamored with Bryson's 200-mile-an-hour ball speed, etc. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't translate to a closer proximity to the hole, it's not worth it. So guys that are getting longer and trying to get longer, I mean, this is fantastic if they're hitting the fairways. Now, it's a little different on the Corn Ferry Tour because the rough isn't so bad, right? It's a little different when you play in Canada on the Mackenzie Tour generally, and so on, because the rough is not as penalizing generally on those tours as it is on the PGA Tour. So, if I do hit in the rough and there's, it's not really a big deal, it's like, okay, I might as well smash it as far as I can. But there comes a point of diminishing returns there where if I'm missing the fairway, my proximity, even though I might be 20 yards closer, is actually worse from that rough lie than it would be out of the fairway. So why am I not just hitting the fairway? So going back to your fade idea, so players, I got to watch DJ, right beside him at the Masters in 2017 with Mackenzie. We're warming up on the Wednesday. And, watched DJ go through his routine with Butch and, watched him hit drivers. And it was unbelievable. At the time, he was number one in the world. He fell down the stairs or whatever the next day and had to withdraw from the tournament. But the day before, watching him on the range, I kind of turned to Mackenzie, who also likes to hit a fade. I said, wow, this is impressive. Let's watch this. And, he had TrackMan on, and, he's flying the ball 314 in the air with a fade, on the range at Augusta. And, and he must have hit 60 drivers. I'll bet you 58 of them were very close to being, definitely playable. You had two that maybe overcut into the rough or something like that. But basically, they were all very usable tee shots. So from a technical standpoint, the ball lands softer, generally because the face-path relationship, you have more loft to the swing direction, whereas a draw, you have less loft to the swing direction. So your spin, people say, well, the fade goes the same distance as the draw. Well, yes, if you're able to create the same spin loft and dynamic loft, yes, it'll go the same distance, but it's hard to create a fade with the same loft characteristics as a draw because you're swinging across it with the face open. So it lands softer, and that's why a lot of players prefer it because they feel like they can get control. And again, if I'm hitting it 320 with a fade, do I really need to hit a draw 335 and risk getting into a lot of trouble? I'm already long enough at that. Number one. Number two is under pressure because I don't have to release the club as much. So now I can kind of hang on and turn my body really hard and use the big muscles and pivot. I don't have to worry about my hands trying to square the face because I'm trying to get the face a little bit open to the swing direction. So I think under pressure, in some ways, it could be an advantage. I don't have to release the club. A lot of times, when players get a little tight, they squeeze the grip a little tighter than they know they are, and as a result, they don't quite square up the face and end up hitting a block. But if I'm always playing that fade and I aim down the left side, even if I push fade it a little bit, it's still probably a reasonably playable shot. Okay, but if I'm setting for a draw down the right side, then I block it, now I'm in trouble.
Yeah, big trouble.
I think there's, a little bit with that. Now, if you talk to obviously Scott Fawcett with Decade and so on and so forth, I mean, you're going to see players miss left, you're going to see players miss right, but a lot of it's the confidence. The player says, "Hey, I'm pretty sure I can hit this shot. And aim down the left side, just pound it, see this little fade." There's less apprehension, so they're probably better. They will probably make a better golf swing if that's different. Well, but it's an interesting thing. I would say, I've got a couple of my Corn Ferry guys that hit draws, and a couple of guys hit fades, and some of the draw guys are really, really good at it, and they hit a lot of fairways. So, I wouldn't say it's something that's a hard truth that says, hey, you have to fade it if you want control. But players that generally, obviously, have gone from a hooking background, like Mackenzie Hughes, my player, and they gravitate over time towards that fade. It becomes a bit of an old friend or a little bit of a comfort for them.
In another swing question for you, along the same lines, is why do you think that the standard for excellence in the swing evolved with Ben Hogan and not, let's say, either a Jack Nicklaus who was obviously extremely successful, or even a Byron Nelson who was known to be on par with at the time he was probably a little better than Hogan, and then retired, and then obviously Hogan became legendary. But do you have any opinion, so to speak, on why that would have evolved the way it did?
Yeah, exactly. And I think two things. Number one is, first of all, Byron Nelson only played golf so he could buy a cattle ranch.
Right. That's kind of
cool, what I mean? Right? Like, so he was, obviously incredibly skilled at golf and had a wonderful career there. But in reality, he was using that because he wanted to be a rancher. And he bought his, cattle ranch and basically retired early and raised cattle. And that was kind of the game plan. He was going to use the golf to sort of pursue that dream. Whereas Hogan was a lifetime player, right? Started the equipment company, started, dibble-dabbling on that side. So he was always, around the game in every capacity. And so I think there's a little bit of, that's part of the reason. And secondly, Hogan was, it was the secrecy, right? He wasn't going to tell anybody what the secret was. He would hit the ball really fantastically, but he wasn't going to tell anybody. So, when you tell somebody they can't have the answer, it just makes them even more interested.
Right.
So there was
Absolutely.
a mystique built around that. And certainly was an incredibly impressive ball striker, no doubt. And, but really, again, also the coverage, right? For many, many years, the publications, the magazines, the Golf Digest, the Golf World, all these things, basically the number one player in the world, everybody tried to copy their swing. So in that year, it was like, we're going to swing like Hogan, and we're going to swing like Arnold Palmer, then we're going to swing like Jack Nicklaus, and we're going to swing like Tom Watson and Greg Norman and Seve Ballesteros. And, literally at the time, because that's how people learned. It was like, well, I'm just going to try and copy what they do, and they're good. So if I do what they do, maybe I can be good. And really, the whole industry was driven that way for 100 years. Until we, as I said, had the advent of high-speed cameras and D-plane and TrackMan and all these things that we have now. We go, well, actually, we have some options here. We don't actually all have to swing like Jack Nicklaus anymore. There's lots of ways to do this. And that's kind of been the fun part of kind of getting into all of this thing is understanding, why aren't people copying Jim Furyk's swing? Face-to-path relationships closer to zero than any other player that Callaway's ever tested. He hits it straighter than any other player that Callaway has ever tested in their facilities. But nobody talks about Jim Furyk's ball striking.
Right. I'm amazed by stuff like that.
Right. He's 50 years old, and he's hitting 73% of his greens in regulation. That's unbelievable. I mean, he doesn't hit it, the distance. He's got 107 or 108 mile-an-hour club head speed, and he's hitting 73% of his greens in regulation. So that man is still hitting the ball incredibly well. And, the last few seasons, he just hasn't putted like he used to putt. He used to be quite a very, very good putter. And, the putter hasn't behaved quite as nicely in the last few years for him. But his ball striking is still incredible. And I said, nobody talks about Jim Furyk. And it's just like, hey, he's the only guy in history that's shooting the 50s twice. Like, give the guy a break. But, because of the swing, and he's a low-key guy and, doesn't talk, doesn't ruffle any feathers, he doesn't create controversy, he's just a really, really, really solid player. And he's quietly gone about his business like a Steve Stricker or like a Matt Kuchar, and racked up a bazillion top tens and obviously made a very lucrative living playing the game. But he's just a low-key guy, but he's got some of the most incredible face-to-path relationships of any player ever.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody talks about it. So, one of the things that, that's one of the patterns that we talk about in the certification is, okay, why does this work? How does it work? Right? We go through the pattern and we understand why Jim Furyk's swing works so well. In a lot of ways, it's actually very similar to Rory's pattern and how they use the trail elbow as what we call punch elbow. And, some of the things that they're doing are very similar. I mean, the amazing thing about Rory is not how far he hits it. It's about how far and straight he hits it. So he basically has the same accuracy levels as Jim Furyk, at least when he's swinging well, but he's 30 yards longer. That's the incredible part, and why he certainly gains tee to green, up until this little bit here where he struggled a bit. But anyway, so it's things like that when you sort of go out of the box and you look at some of the other swings in history. You look at Calvin Peete, right? The guy led driving accuracy on the PGA Tour like every single year in the 80s. I mean, literally just hit it dead straight. And it's like, okay, well, why? Like, how's that work? And that's where we're getting better as an industry. It's just understanding all of those pieces and the anatomy and how they're manipulating the anatomy to create these great sort of face-to-path relationships. Not everybody needs to swing like Adam Scott. It's a beautiful golf swing. It's a wonderful golf swing, but there's other ways of doing it as well.
Right. You use a fair amount of technology. Is there any one piece that's your favorite that you've really found out has allowed you to make the bigger impact or the bigger difference with your students?
I would say the most recent one, and certainly I use some. I actually don't use a ton. I'll use Fan Putt Lab, for diagnosing some putting issues, so on. Obviously, I use TrackMan and
the usual suspects.
Yeah, the usual suspects. And basically, the problem with those tools is that sometimes pros rely on them too much.
Yes,
right?
I would agree.
At the end of the day, it's a tool, right? It should be backing up what you're giving that player. So, I mean, I can predict to a player what's going to happen to their TrackMan numbers before they hit the shot. If you do this is what's going to happen on TrackMan. And, so that's what you need to do is get the swing to a level where you understand it that well and understand if you manipulate this joint the way that we're doing it, I'm going to create this, this difference in our swing direction or the low point value or the swing point. And, I can tell you what it's going to be. I can predict it within, a pretty accurate amount. And then when it happens, obviously it makes you look like a sorcerer here a little bit. But the whole thing is you're using that as a tool to, objectify what you're teaching them. You're not looking at it and just spitting out numbers and go, yeah, that was okay. It was 2 degrees right, 2 degrees up. And it's like, no, that's just, they can read that themselves. They don't need you to tell them that. So anyway, so I'll use a little bit of that. But one of the things that was a big difference for me, certainly in the last 3 years, was hack motion and understanding the risk to a large degree and really getting in deep with some of the risk stuff because, by the time you started to really measure the risk and what was happening and how different players were releasing the club, quite a bit different. Guys like Morikawa, Victor Hovland, DJ Koepka, all these guys are what I call Cobra Pattern, which is sort of a flexion toward extension release pattern. You look at Tiger, you look at Tommy Fleetwood, you look at Rory to a certain extent. These guys are all what we call a stable extension toward flexion with supination model of release. So there's a lot difference. Like literally, it's almost 180-degree opposite release patterns.
So one of them for the listeners who aren't as familiar with some of the terminology, the Tiger group where you're in flexion a little longer, it would be what would most people consider more of a hold-off release. Would you say that's a fair way to explain it in general?
Not really.
Okay.
Nobody's holding it off. Nobody's really holding it off unless they're trying to hold it off.
Right.
Maybe somebody holds it off, maybe like a Zach Johnson or something. But really, at the end of the day, the speed has to go somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, as a player, you have a choice in what directions that speed goes into. So you have three different directions it can move into. It can move into extension or toward, let's say, scooping, if you want to call it that. You can move it around the forearm, okay, into supination. Okay, you can also hinge upward and downward into radial and ulnar deviation, which is the up and down motion of the release.
Right.
So what we see in all releases is everybody is kind of doing all three to a point, but there's definitely different trends. So a player that hits a fade on tour, like DJ, gets that lead wrist into a ton of flexion, holds the radial bone open, okay? So they're not supinating at all. They're pivoting their body open, but they're holding the forearm open as well. They're not turning the forearm. And what they're doing is they're releasing the wrist toward extension. Now, at impact, it's not an extension. It's still in flexion. So it's still, call it the flat left wrist, but the wrist is moving toward extension. So post-impact, the wrist pushes into extension primarily. There's not a lot of supination. There's not a lot of twisting on the shaft. So it makes it very conducive to hitting a nice high fade. Okay? Now, the flip side, what we were taught certainly as youngsters growing up was, let's say, a classic turn-down release. So what you did was you took the club up to the top, and then maybe you added a little bit of bowing on the way down or a little bit of flexion on the way down, but you kept that the same, and then you turned your wrist or turned your forearm to square the face. So players like Tommy Fleetwood, Tiger Woods, said Rory, a lot of the best push drawers in the world, that's the release pattern. Okay?
Kind of what Johnny Miller used to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. So Johnny Miller would have been a class at what I call wrist option A, which is what we call a stable extension toward flexion release. So you're holding the flexion and then you're squaring the face with the supination. And he used to call it a trap draw or a turn down draw. And that release pattern is very prevalent in professional golf. But nowadays we're seeing more and more players working toward what I call Cobra Pattern, which is just this push the wrist way into flexion, basically too much flexion, and then let a little bit of it out at impact. And that's kind of how that release works. And it's generally conducive. So guys like Hovland and Morikawa and DJ and Koepka, they all tend to hit the ball straight with a fade. Hit it very high, very, very controlled. So it's an interesting sort of release pattern. Guys that turn it down, like Tiger and so on, it's interesting from a strength standpoint. Generally, the turn down guys are all excellent wedge players and chippers and pitchers because they're learning to control the loft of the club with the amount of flexion that they use at impact, and then they square it up with the supination. So they get very good at flighting the ball, hitting stingers, hitting, different shot shapes and so on. The guys that release it like DJ are very, very good drivers of the ball and tend to hit the ball kind of in a very uniform way. So they don't move the ball around as much. They tend to play one shot really, really well. Okay, so they don't. Koepka draws a little bit, but they generally are hitting a stock shot the same way. So a little bit less of the sort of 9 ball flights and a little bit more of sort of a really, really good, consistent 1 ball flight.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with pushing the wrist into a hard amount of flexion is sometimes it gets a little tricky with the chipping and the pitching. And, Victor Hovland's had to work really, really hard on that part of his game. It's now very good, but he was really struggling when he first came on tour because you're basically de-lofting that wedge in an absolutely amazing amount. And then, you're trying to scoop it at impact to get the loft back onto it. So there's a little bit of a low point issue there when you do that. So he would skull chips and chunk chips and do all sorts of stuff because he was working the wrist from flexion to extension. So in general, we don't want a lot of that, if we can handle it, because it's a little bit more dangerous when we start to talk about the lead edge.
Yeah, especially when you get on tight lies and they get under a little pressure, I would have to assume. At least that's kind of what I've seen without knowing the names of the patterning, because I haven't used hack motion. But as far as running this through my own brain and real recognizing that the types of risk positions they have, let's say, come at the top and then transition coming into impact. They get the jitters pretty quick on tight lies.
Well, what happened too is when I first got, I've been involved with the company now for about 2.5 years, and when I first got exposed to the product, I said, "Wow, this is really good." And the guys that sort of created the product, were okay golfers, but they had collected a bunch of data from tour players, and they kind of didn't know what to do with it, right? Which is kind of what happens because they're looking at it going, "Well, we've got all this great information, but we really can't make sense of it. So we need somebody like myself or somebody to look at it and say, well, what are you seeing? Are you seeing patterns of movement?" And so a couple of years ago, I did a presentation at the PGA show in Orlando, which is online somewhere. And people can go watch that. And I kind of go through all four of the main tour releases or what we see in the data from the different tour players. And there's four main patterns, but the two main patterns are certainly this what I call wrist option A and Cobra Pattern. But
is there a reason that you named it Cobra Pattern, or did it?
Yeah, the Cobra Pattern started with it's just I like to name my patterns a bit of notoriety, and people kind of follow some of those things. They're like, hey, this is kind of interesting.
Yeah, me being one of them.
I wonder why.
Right. You're guilty as charged. Right. That's why I asked.
Exactly. I sucked you in there. That was good. No, but I mean, basically, Cobra Pattern was when you push that wrist into flexion so much, the trail arm, the right arm, actually ends up in a position that's very twisted. Okay, so your right arm, the upper arm is actually externally rotated. Mm-hmm. The lower arm is actually pronated, or turned down. So you've got this torque in your right arm because the upper arm is actually externally rotated. But when you turn your palm down and externally rotate, there's a massive tension across the forearm. And basically it's coiled up like a snake. So one of my juniors actually came up with the name and said, yeah, it feels like my arm's like a snake. I was like, all right, that's perfect. I'm going to call it Cobra Pattern. and that's kind of how it was born. And then that applied. So initially that was the wrist kind of pattern. And then, from there we kind of evolved, or, I built an anatomy or basically a swing pattern around those wrist conditions. And, you can see that with players like Morikawa, Victor Hall. And there's some differences, but the way that they're using the trail arm and the lead wrist are incredibly similar in those swings. And they tend to produce sort of a mid-high fade for the bulk of the shots there.
Do most golfers have a predisposition to have one pattern, or are they being taught, even at the tour level, as they modify swings to gravitate towards a flexed wrist at the top? For some of you out there who might not know the terminology, more of what people know as a bowed left wrist or trail lead wrist. I'm sorry, or is
I think you'll. I mean, there's always outliers both ways, right? You're going to have some players. Phil Mickelson tends to be quite cuppy at the top.
Mm-hmm.
Freddie Couples back in the day was extremely cuppy at the top, and he was the number one player in the world at one time, and so on. So there's always going to be outliers here, but. Not that one is better, and the problem with saying, this is better or worse, or this player needs to keep the face more open, or this player needs to have it more closed. I mean, the current trend, let's say in top golf instruction, is let's get this thing kind of closed coming down, and now we'll just rotate through the ball, and,
right.
and life will be good. And to a certain extent, there are some people that can certainly do that. Now, the problem is, as players get older, the biggest problem is thoracic to pelvic rotational amounts. Okay, so the ability to separate your pelvis from your thorax, if you can do that, yes, that's a good option. Most of the golfers that we see and we teach every day that are limited with their flexibility cannot separate their thorax from their pelvis very well. So if they try and open up and get open and do all these things, which is currently the trendy thing to do, they're simply going to come straight over the top and they're going to slice it. If the wrist conditions are stronger, they'll just dead pull it. So there's different strokes for different folks, and that thoracic to pelvic rotation now is a big, big key when we're designing golf swings on, what kind of pattern they fall into. So at the end of the day, the club face at the bottom is squaring up very rapidly, and it's not squaring up at a consistent rate. So what I mean by that is, as your club enters the final 2 feet of the swing, the face and path are not on top of each other yet. Okay? So unlike, people think that, hey, if I line up the face super early and I just turn, this is going to work. But there's velocity there in the angular release, or the lag release, if you will, of the wrist, that is causing the club face squares up at a faster rate than the arc squares up. So basically the face is staying open, for a long time, and then at the very bottom it is squaring up. Now, different players have different rates of squaring up, and this is where we talk about the rate of closure, and how to either slow that down, or for some players they need to speed it up. So 2 players, for example, on the wide ends of the spectrum in terms of rate of closure, Victor Hovland has the slowest rate of closure ever tested on the PGA Tour at 675 degrees per second. Okay?
So he's keeping it very square the entire
to a point. Now, because his wrist is in flexion, the face is more closed. Okay, his body is pivoting, his body is rotating. So just the fact that your body rotates is causing the face to close. Okay, but the average tour amount is somewhere that sits around 1,800 to 2,000 degrees per second. Now, somebody who hits the ball incredibly straight on the other end of the spectrum is Francesco Molinari, who hits the ball incredibly straight, has a rate of closure that sits around 2,800 degrees per second.
Wow.
So
more than 4 times, 4.5 times more.
Exactly. So this is why the verdict is still out, right? Francesco has won the British Open. He's one of the straightest, golfers on the European Tour in the last 15 years. He's a heck of a player. He has a very fast rate of closure compared to Victor Hovland, who's also an excellent player from Norway. And, I've had the pleasure actually to work a little bit with Victor many years ago. But, he's always hit the ball incredibly straight. And so what's better, right? Well, both are producing incredibly good golf shots. So the verdict at the end of the day, in my opinion, is going to be whatever your rate of closure is, you want it to be consistent. Right, that's what we see. Is the best ball strikers don't go from 2,800 degrees per second down to 1,200 degrees per second up to 2,100. It's within sort of 50 to 80, maybe 100, sort of degrees per second each and every shot. So the rate that you are, whether you're a fast rate of closure player or a slow rate of closure player, tends to be very, very consistent.
Yeah, and I guess that's always the question I was trying to ask was: Are there certain individuals who gravitate towards one versus the other, and if their coach unknowingly tries to put them in a different pattern, can really screw up their game or injure them? That they have a predisposition to have one of the 3 or 4 patterns that you've identified.
Yes, unfortunately, that happens every day on tour. Well, it's one of those things where, again, I mean, one of the problems we have with tour coaches, just in general, is that, a lot of times they want to stamp their brand of swing onto that player, right? So if you work with a certain coach, and then certainly back in the day, David Ledbetter was certainly guilty of that, and he would teach all of his players the methodology that basically worked for Nick Price and David Frost and Nick Faldo. And basically, and I went through the same sort of checklists and things that those players would have gone through themselves. And in my case, it helped me. It helped me greatly. But perhaps for other players, it wouldn't work so well. So I think we're getting better at that as an industry, that coaches are starting to be more versatile with their techniques. And truthfully, it's just that a lot of coaches teach one way really, really well, right? But they don't necessarily understand how all the other ways work.
Mm-hmm.
So I think hopefully, as an industry, we're getting better at that. But you certainly see that, and a lot of times it's like, okay, come to see me. I'll give you the standard swing that I give everybody, and you'll hit the ball great. And it's like, well, yeah, that might work, and it might not work.
Dr. Scott Lynn and I discussed this a little bit in that let's say the last 10 to 15 years was a lot of gathering of information, like TrackMan recording or Hack Motion or Sam Putlab,
Yeah.
all these things that gathered the information and kept track of it. And what he thought, and I thought as well, was, and what you're from what I think I hear you're saying is, and what I've seen you do in your lectures, and one of the reasons I asked this question for you to identify those 4 different patterns is it's becoming more important to specialize for what that individual needs based off this mountain of information that golf coaches and scientists and everybody are gathering and have access to. So it's like player A, if they're a Cobra pattern, and you try to put them in the other one of the other 3 patterns, you could really do some damage to them.
Absolutely.
Right?
And I mean, as I said, there's lots, unfortunately, there's lots of that that's happened. And some of these players end up obviously, being sort of beaten out of the game. And, and it's not that it's all the coach's fault. It's like, you got to understand too, is tour players can be incredibly difficult in terms of being able to absorb new information and to make changes. And, you can give them, the keys to the kingdom, and they still have to pick it up and walk the walk and go through the process. And some of them won't do that. And, if it looks weird, feels weird, runs contrary to the narrative that they have in their mind, they're going to fight you on it. And you've got to fight tooth and nail sometimes to get them to do what you want. Even though you could be 100% right, if it doesn't fit their narrative, and some of the things that they've grown up with, or maybe other coaches have told them, and you're running contrary to that, they're gonna sort of to stop you. And now they get sort of a half version, right? And that's the problem, is you either kind of got to go all in here and do it all, or we're just going to kind of band-aid what you're doing and understand how your swing kind of works. So to get back to your answer, is now that we're understanding more of how it all goes together, like the swing catalyst data, like the, obviously the gears and all these different sort of things that we can use to measure, and we understand how different patterns work, now we can make a correction that one thing is going to change 25 things. And now for that player, they can get back out to going out there and hopefully winning millions of dollars, right? They're not shelved for 3 months because we're rebuilding everything.
Mm-hmm.
We're now saying, no, this is how your swing works, but this one little piece here needs to be adjusted. And as we move that one piece around, all of a sudden you've changed 20 other things, and now all of a sudden we're back in business again. And that's where the magic is in terms of understanding the anatomy really well and understanding the joint segments and how they move, is you can make incredibly powerful changes in an hour, in 3 hours, in a day, simply by, sort of pinpointing the root cause, and where to go with that. And that's why coaches need to understand multiple ways of swinging a golf club really, really well. Not just, I kind of get it. I read an article on it, and, kind of abandoned it. It's like, no, I want you to understand that up, down, sideways. And, I've got some of my certified coaches. I mean, one of my guys has gone through 22 schools, something like that. And I've got guys that are in the tens for sure. Multiple guys in Sweden and Denmark have gone through my certifications 10 different times. The material hasn't changed that much, but they keep coming back to it because they want to understand it better and better and better. And as they do that, they become much more powerful coaches. And as I said, they can, what's the line about, kind of speak softly and carry a big stick, right? They've got that one thing that's going to make all the difference in the world for that player. And, we're not always right either. And don't get me wrong, it's not like there is always going to be, let's throw some mud on the wall and see what sticks a little bit here. Because you're always feeling out that relationship with the player and how willing are they to make change. So that's going to determine to a certain extent how in depth we get. And if they're sort of, it's kind of like dating a little bit. It's like they're kind of feeling out what you're kind of offering, and you're kind of feeling out, their response to that. And between that, you have to come up with a solution. And sometimes it's not going to be 100% of what you want that player to do because they're just unwilling to do it. So you have to collaborate a little bit, and the best coaching relationships are definitely very collaborative, as opposed to just, yeah, I'm going to dictate to you what you do, and you better do it, right? That really doesn't work well with these great players, because obviously they've played a phenomenal. They've played the game at an incredibly high level. So we have to trust some of their judgments and their feels as well, even if it clashes a little bit with your own belief systems. So that's a challenge, right? And if I only know one way of coaching, or I only know one way of swinging the golf club, I've now limited my options with that player. So we need to have multiple. I mean, I teach 9 different swing patterns, basically. If you're sort of pigeonhole it, there's basically 9 patterns, but within those patterns, there's going to be sub-patterns. There's going to be idiosyncrasies within the patterns that the player can't exactly do, like, let's say, the model. And as a result, that's okay. They become their own model. And at the end of the day, we're teaching this individual how their own swing works.
And that's in your certification program, which I want to touch on some more. We briefly hit it on a little bit earlier, but it is as far as you and the person who's controlling the material and you're learning more yourself every day, every month, every year. Do you find that those 9 patterns of swing has changed, let's say, over the last couple of years, and do you see it changing in the future as well as the sub patterns, so where you learn something new and then you add it, or you might modify what you have a little bit to add in something that you've learned recently?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the patterns which has sort of been in and out of my certification is what we call a non-circular hub pattern. Okay, and that was something, looking at the research of Dr. Stephen Nesbitt, and looking at basically he created, or had a computer actually create a swing pattern that was going to produce the most efficient sort of transfer of energy to the club. And with the shape of the circular motion of the swing, it actually wasn't circular. It was kind of a very funky shape here, but that pattern would produce as much as sort of a 5 to 6% increase in power, as opposed to sort of a more circular pattern. So, it was interesting doing that. Now, the problem with that pattern is that it's very complex. So you're talking about the shape of what we call the hub, which is basically a point on the grip between your hands, and the shape that would curve in the swing, and the overall shape of this would make it possible to produce more speed. And the closest player on tour that has a non-circular hub path would be probably Cameron Champ. Okay, so that swing pattern, his downswing, is sort of very close to the model that Dr. Stephen Nesbitt came up with in 2006. But how do you teach that? How do you get that across the field? It's very complex. So as a result, and Mike Jacobs and Brian Manzella have sort of extended a lot of the work that Dr. Stephen Nesbitt sort of pioneered a little bit. But it's a tough pattern because you're almost going beyond the anatomy of this. You're talking about the hub shape. You're talking about forces and torques on the grip and so on. And 10 years' time, by the way, that's what's going to happen. In 2004, Dr. Koike in Japan built an instrumented grip that was able to measure the forces that were going into the grip. Because that's all we have to control the swing. It's really the forces that apply to the grip. That instrumented grip cost $1.1 million.
Oh, that's it? Give me 2 of them.
Yeah. Well, the cool thing is Dr. Kwan traveled, I think, last year or the year before to Japan to meet with Dr. Koike, and they built a second instrumented grip because Dr. Kwan wants to tie in his ground reaction research into forces and input in the hand. Some really interesting kind of fun stuff that's going on right now with the research in the world. So when that happens, that instrumented grip will be the new track. Mm-hmm. That will be the new standard, because what you'll be able to do is, if we can get that price of an instrumented grip down to $10,000 or something reasonable, literally it will measure your inputs into the grip, and we will have tested enough tour players to understand what they're doing to the grip at different points of the swing, and actually be able to teach golf that way. And when that happens, there might be a little vibration when you do it wrong, and maybe a red light or something comes on when you do it wrong, and you can practice the swings to understand how to put the right forces in the grip. And at that point, it's going to actually be pretty easy to teach golf, because we'll be able to actually put it to a level beyond the anatomy. And now we're actually putting the actual inputs into the club itself.
That's very interesting that you bring that up, because when I spent a number of years doing some very in-depth club fitting that was based off a lot of neuroscience and the guy that I learned from at that time, and I'm trying to get him on the show. He's such a crotchety old bastard, though. I don't think he's kind of getting close to retirement if he's not there already. But what he was able to do was measure how much output energy an individual's giving on the swing, load factor, shaft profile, all those things factored in. But the biggest portion of it was how much energy that person's producing, and then what energy load is that shaft able to handle. And he narrowed it down to within 2 to 3 cycles. If it was great, if your shaft variance was 2 to 3 cycles outside of where you should be, it was going to negatively affect you in some way, shape, or form in the swing. And I would love to have something like that grip to see how that system, because he's had it for 40 years. How that would work, because he would dial in somebody's shaft, and it was absolutely ridiculous.
Well, exactly. Now you bring up a whole nother, kettle of fish there in terms of being able to, the matchup, if you will, of the swing to the equipment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we can talk for days on that. But, similar to, this is all the research that, Sasha McKenzie does, and he kind of reverse engineers the data to figure out the forces on the handle.
Mm-hmm.
So his data has come out incredibly close to the measured data that Dr. Koike produced. But understand that this is derived data as opposed to, reverse engineered data, as opposed to actually measured data, right? And even when you look at your TrackMan, right, how much of that is actually measured and how much of that is actually calculated, right? And each of the manufacturers have slightly different amounts. Some of it's measured, and some of it needs algorithms to sort of calculate what actually is occurring. There's a slight difference between measurement and calculation.
Right.
So, as a lot of these, and Sasha, another good Canadian here, is, I think just an absolutely brilliant researcher and very, very thorough with his work, and, highly cited and highly sought after, in terms of opinions on things, because he has, been one of the most influential guys in terms of the last 10 years of research, for sure, in terms of the influence, in terms of some of the direction of things. So it is, it's a very positive place, and that's the thing is as golf instructors have gone into, and part of the thing that we do in certifications is taking sort of a Coles Notes version of some of this stuff and saying there's so much data out there. It's how do we make sense of it all, right? And how do we make this into a workable project and understand how it all goes together? That's the bridge that needs to happen between the PhDs and the golf professionals.
Yes, and Doc Lynn and
that's where we've been working.
There is a distinct difference between science and then the application of that science. And then you take all of these different sciences, physics, biomechanics, physiology, swing mechanics, and the list goes on, and then you add the application of those, and it's like, okay, you have all these sciences, and it makes it a little more difficult, a lot more difficult for teachers or coaches, but the ones who are getting really good at it know how that recipe needs to be tweaked, right? So what part of which science needs to supersede the others for their swing to get where it needs to be. I have a friend here in Hilton Head. Philippe's a fifth-generation master baker from France, and he was telling me one day about how you have to adjust for humidity and temperature and all these different things. And it's like, okay, I'm relating that to coaching. And it's like, okay, yeah, you have the physics of the club, you have the physics of this, or the biomechanics of the swing and how the shaft and all these things move. And which of those sciences do you modify if two are in competition for improving somebody's game? And that takes a very, very astute coach and with a great understanding of all of them, as you have, that allows their students to improve at an accelerated rate.
Yeah, and to a point, I would say most of the time, it works, and most of the time you're successful, and then, sometimes you're not. And I had just a quick aside, I had a very interesting lesson today with one of my members at the Pulpit Club, actually has ALS.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, his right hand basically doesn't work. So here we are, we're trying to fashion a golf swing that he can go out and enjoy the game with basically a right hand that doesn't work. So really interesting. Now all of a sudden we've got to go way outside the box and hopefully allow and create a swing. And by the end of the session, I spent 2 hours at it with him, and by the end of the session he was hitting a nice compressed little draw, and really there was no right hand movement in the swing at all. So just, those are the kind of lessons sometimes that are most gratifying, because I learned so much, because here's a different situation, and you've got to come up with a solution. Coaches that work with blind golfers, coaches that work with, obviously handicapped individuals, are often incredible coaches, because they're looking at the anatomy and obviously the capabilities of that player and coming up with solutions. And at the end of the day, if we can come up with viable solutions for all our players, then, we're doing our job and we're doing it well. And that's what, certainly for me, brings me back every day is I hope I never, I hope I never think I know it all, for sure, because, at that point it's going to be kind of boring. And, the fact that we're always trying to get better and we're always searching and we're trying to create these parallels and have a better understanding of what's going on is really what drives me as a golf professional.
Mm-hmm. That brings me to a question I've got for you, in that you've got a very cool story, and I don't know your curriculum well enough, but I would have to imagine that part of your curriculum is about increasing swing speed.
Yeah.
And when you were watching lumberjack competition.
Yeah.
So could you tell that story? Because that's a pretty cool story, how you took a lumberjack competition into making it part of your curriculum. But more importantly, you're getting people to see significant increases in swing speed.
Right. So about 8 or 9 years ago, I'd say, 8 or 9 years ago, I, for whatever reason, flipping through YouTube and some Canadian lumberjack competition. We have those things. They're actually on TV, believe it or not. But anyways, there was a clip of this lumberjack thing, and I'm watching these guys basically chop wood. And I was like, okay, I'm watching them do this, and the really strong guys were doing some distinctive movements, and they would kind of raise themselves way up on their toes, and they'd really extend their spine, and they'd really obviously raise that axe really, really high, and then they'd kind of violently crunch forward in a massive sort of crunch position or sit up position on the way down, and then they'd hurl their arms down into the wood, and they chop this thing in one blow or whatever it happened to be. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. Wonder what happens if you did that in a golf swing. So I did it in a golf swing, and the very first swing, and the next day I went to my academy, and I was like, I'll try this. And my 7-iron speeds normally, at the time was sort of 90 miles an hour ish, and so I do the swing. I was like, okay, I'm just going to come up in my toes. I'm going to extend my spine. I'm going to feel like I'm an axe here, but I'm going to obviously add a little bit of rotation to this. So basically the same movement the axe choppers were doing, and then kind of come down really hard and drop my center of mass and do all these things. First swing, 96 miles an hour. Boom, 6 miles an hour. And I was like, holy crap. I don't even know what I just did there. Okay, let's see if I can reproduce this. Sure enough, bang on. So by the end of that session, I had, consistently produced speeds that were 96 to 98 miles an hour on the 7-iron. I was like, okay. So as I continued to research this over the years, I mean, this is a principle that you see in all of the long drivers now, is a very large lift or vertical component as they push away in that backswing. They raise their center of mass quite high, and then they drop it very violently in transition, and they end up jumping again as they hit the ground. Right, and this is all before we knew swing catalysts and all these other different things, and we're actually able to measure it. And I didn't know why it worked, but it worked. So I got talking to Dr. Kwan actually at the PGA show, and I told him what I was doing, and he goes, he's funny. He goes, "Yeah, that would work." that was like the whole conclusion. He was like, "Yeah, that would work." I'm like, "Okay, all right. So why exactly it was working?" So anyway, kind of figured out that obviously we've got some what we call center of mass displacement as a huge power source. So guys like Rory, guys like Jamie Sadlowski, guys like Tiger back in the day that would drop like crazy in transition were spiking the ground reaction forces. What we know now is spiking the ground reaction force. So I had sort of fallen into this. I didn't understand it at all. I just knew it worked. So I started to teach this to some of my players. And I had one of my juniors go from 91 club head speed with the driver to 108 miles an hour in 2 weeks. Just working on that drill.
Serious jump.
Okay. 17 miles an hour faster. And now, certainly his movement at the start was not very efficient, and by the end of it was very efficient. But, it was like, wow, here I am, and this is like an added bonus. I can actually get people a lot more speed. And then as the years went by, and sort of to a certain extent, it's almost like, the things like GASP and swing catalyst and these things start to validate, what's going on. And now we know exactly what goes on. And we know the timing of those movements is incredibly, important. And so that became a large part of my curriculum and my certification. That became a large part of, and as time went by, I was able to describe it better because I understood it better by talking to guys like Dr. Lin and Dr. Kwan and so on, who were able to tell me why this was working. And now it's, I've done 2 ground reaction force certifications now with Steve Furlonger in the UK. And Steve is one of my certified coaches over there, and he's gotten really big into ground reaction force and training long drive champions and tour players and stuff to get longer. And, so all of that sort of stemmed from the original stuff that I had sort of stumbled into by watching a lumberjack competition.
That's a cool story. And I won't even ask you what the hell made you pause on a lumberjack competition. We'll save that for maybe the next time you come on. We'll keep this one focused on golf. But yeah. When I heard that, I thought I gotta ask Scott to tell that story because it is pretty cool. How something so what seems so detached from the golf swing would actually turn out to be just something that has probably changed a lot of students of yours games considerably.
Oh, yeah, for certain. And now it's become somewhat commonplace now, or common knowledge to players that are working on club head speed is sort of, and this is sort of tying the science of guys like Dr. Kwan and so on, who was describing this in very sort of, let's say, dry ways, if you will, from sort of the science perspective, and saying, well, here's kind of a good example of how it's done from a body positioning standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And now, obviously, swing catalyst being probably the leader in ground reaction force, we start measuring, laterals and verticals and torques against the plates and all the rest of the stuff. And it's now become so much, obviously, more, involved, but just kind of falling into it. And, that's honestly, going back to the voracious reading of things is often, I would say, a lot of the ideas and the things that permeate my brain are coming outside of golf, because there are other sports that have been much better researched. There's been other things, martial arts is a big one,
mm-hmm.
For me, because I used to do karate and so on when I was younger, and I always had an interest in martial arts, and, there's interesting ground reaction forces and things like that. So we call something called impulse dynamics is something that stemmed from actually a Stanford research in 2008 with a kung fu master from China, and how this guy at 55 years old had these absolutely devastatingly fast strikes and everything else in martial arts, and he was using the ground to generate basically 3 times his body weight of force in an impulse that he was using to basically speed up his body. And that's a real thing, and it's a measured thing. And so how do you apply that to the golf swing? Right? And that's part of one of the things that we covered in the certification. So really fascinating, stuff that's coming from way outside of golf. And those things excite me because it's like parallels. You start to see, why does Rory uses impulse dynamics really well. We start to look at what he does with his footwork. He actually picks up his left heel on the way down with his driver. So if you ever watch it in close motion from the back, Rory's left heel is actually not really off the ground at the top of his swing. He actually lifts it and then slams it back down in his downswing. So he's actually picking it up as he starts down, which is very odd. But by doing so, he's spiking the ground reaction force much sharper, and he's able to use some of that to generate rotational energy.
Remember that years ago, it had to be the early 90s, I think, Golf Digest, when they had, maybe it was 92 or 3, when Davis and Freddie were the number 1 and number 2 guys, I think, in at least on the PGA Tour, maybe in the world or right around there. But remember they used to have this full spreads of swings, and Davis was up on both toes at impact, and everybody was saying, well, if he learned to have better footwork and he'd have better control, he'd win a lot more and all this other shit. And now you just look back at those people and say, you really want to go down that path again?
Historically, there's been, certain hiccups in the industry, and everybody taught one way. But I mean, that's, again, it's nobody's fault. It's just we just didn't have a lot of really, really smart people with really, really good instrumentation measuring golf swings. So it became a visual exercise. This is what we think they're doing. We can see it, so it must be right. But what we couldn't see was under the hood, right? And that's where, swing analysts and some of this stuff is very powerful, because all of a sudden we can now see what's under the hood and tune up the engine, if you will, under the hood. And the outcome is going to actually change the kinetics of the swing and the movements of the swing. And, all we've done is, use the ground a little bit differently. So it's, but it's also not the be-all and end-all. So one of the things, again, it falls into, going down Alice in Wonderland's hole there to a certain extent. If you delve too much in one direction with technology, you end up not seeing the swing from other directions. So if I become a master at just ground reaction forces, well, what about the club face? What about the grip? What about the flight? What about the feel? At a tour level, some players want to feel themselves release the club. Some players don't want to feel a release ever. Right? So how do I tune all of that and build this swing that's going to encompass all of those things? So technology is wonderful if we're using it as this diagnostic tool and to validate what we're doing with the swing. But we need a much more macro view of the golf swing in terms of what we're doing with all of the pieces. And that's why we need a great understanding of all of these components and not just one component.
Right. If you want that recipe, you want that thing to come out right, you've got to know how to modify based off the internal and external components and variables that are affecting that swing. And
absolutely. You take a player, for example, really quick, player coming down in a lot of extension with the face wide open. You teach them to torque the ground really, really hard. They're never going to square the face up in 100 years, and they're going to hit it 100 miles to the right. So there's matchups or, things that have to happen. So if that wrist is in flexion, the face is a lot stronger. Well, now I can teach them to torque the ground harder. Right? So those two matchups will kind of work.
Right.
The pitch of the shaft, the plane of the shaft, is it coming down shallow, is it coming down steep? All these things are going to influence your lower body mechanics and how you use the ground reaction forces. So players that can't rotate very well and basically might need to slide, right? Slide gets a bad rap in golf. So, players need it. So for as much as Rory McIlroy rotates, Rory has the largest pelvic slide of just about any PGA Tour player. He slides an absolute ton. And he needs to because he likes to hit push draws.
Yeah, he needs that time.
He needs time to get that club behind him enough to be able to do that. Yes, he rotates like a madman, absolutely. But he complements that with a ton of lateral movement. So that's the kind of stuff where we can't go down the avenue. This is why we can't just say, this is how it's done. And that's the only way. I mean, anybody that tells you, to your listeners out there, if one person says this is the way to do it, that you need to run away.
Yeah, run for the hills.
Because they obviously, absolutely, they haven't spent any time on the tour where there's 100 guys on the range, and you can find every fault in the book on the range at a PGA Tour event. You'll see cup wrists, you'll see bowed wrists, you'll see steep shafts, you'll see flat shafts, you'll see everything under the sun, and guess what? They all hit it great.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because that particular set of matchups with how they use the ground, how they use the face, how they use the pitch and shaft, all those things work for that player. And, we have to recognize, we have to do a better job of that as an industry to recognize that so that we can say, yes, we don't need to change everything about a player. If we pick the right pieces, we can make some incredibly positive influences without actually tearing it all apart. So now the time that player spends in rehab, if you will, trying to build a swing is shortened, which now they can get back out of there on tour and obviously go, hopefully make themselves a good living. But if I'm spending weeks and weeks of struggle, I'm taking away the opportunity, obviously, to play good in the tournament. So in this day and age, for a tour player just scratching by, I mean, if they don't play well, they're off the tour.
Right, and for some of the listeners out there who the demographic maybe of someone listening, it's like if you had knee or hip replacement 25 years ago, you were probably laid up for about 6 weeks before they started moving you around. Nowadays, they want you moving like within hours of post-surgery.
Right.
So
exactly.
the advancements in medical and golf and measurement and everything else is allowing that to happen.
Absolutely. And it's interesting just to, and that's kind of an interesting topic. Guys like Tiger, guys like Jordan Spieth, guys like Rory McIlroy have all the time in the world to work on their swings because they have full status. They're never going to lose that status, right? The guy who's near the bottom of the list, 125th, who's fighting to keep his card, he tries to take a few weeks off to make a swing change, and it doesn't pan out well. He's lost 3 weeks of possibly making money, and he might lose his card and never get to the PGA Tour again. So it's a much riskier proposition for the players that are a little bit underneath to actually make these swing changes, even though they might need to. It's actually very difficult because they have to obviously be out there and hopefully make some cuts and make enough money to keep their card. But any of these major winners, any of these guys who are destined for the Hall of Fame, it would take 10 years before they're going to lose status. So they've got all the time in the world. They want to take 3 months off and work on their swing. Go ahead. And Tiger certainly has done it 5 or 6 times.
Crazy, isn't
it? Right.
I guess he had to keep himself interested. That and a continual search for, as he described, you want to own his swing, you want to have it perfect in his eyes. Who's going to fault the guy?
And for the naysayers, each time he changed it, he came back pretty darn well. And, now we look at it historically and we say that maybe that 2000, 2001, 2002 version was maybe the best in terms of statistically, but he also had a different body then, too. So it's hard to, maybe he made a lot more putts that year. There's a lot of things that are difficult to quantify. And, the most amazing certainly is obviously rebuilding his body and obviously winning the 2019 Masters. That's just in the history of sport. I can't really think of anybody in any other sport that's gone through that much sort of trauma and then been able to come back and win at the highest levels. I can't really think of anybody else that's actually done that. And I mean, if that's not his greatest achievement, it's pretty darn close. And obviously, the man's done a lot of tremendous things. You know, I think the most impressive thing he's ever done is actually his amateur career, winning 3 U.S. juniors and then followed by 3 U.S. amps in a row. He won 58 matches in a row.
Yeah, that's like those things that, like Nelson's streak of, was it 11 in a row, DiMaggio's hit streak. And there's just some records in sports that aren't going to be touched. And that's 6 USGAs in a row. I don't think that's ever going to happen again.
Not a chance. Not a chance. I mean, that's just, I mean, there's not one round that somebody just didn't have the best round of their life and knock them off, or he just played awful and you know, and didn't get through. I mean, that is an unbelievable fact. I just can't get over how someone could win 58 matches in a row and walk away with all those championships. It's not like these guys were slouches. I mean, these are the best amateurs in the world. And, you know, 58 wins in a row. Like, just.
You know, one question I got to ask you, because you've been in the era and you've been out on tour and you've seen what those elite players are doing. The search for distance and the desire for a lot of these players, and you know, Bryson has really set fire to this. At what point do you think, with your knowledge of the body and the swing and everything else, that swinging that hard starts to become a detriment as far as the long term on the body, and that it's not conducive to lengthy careers of golf, which most people play for a lifetime, and maybe they're making so much money now they don't have to play for 25 years.
Yeah, and I think you see that in all sports, right? As hockey players have gotten, time has gone by, right? They have a shorter career, but it's more lucrative, right? So they make $10 million a year for 5 or 8 years, and then they're done. You know, their bodies are shot, their bodies are done, and I think we're seeing more of that on tour. I mean, you look at guys like Jason Day. You know, he's got severe back trouble at early 30s. You've got guys have pushed themselves really hard to hit the ball really, really far. It is hard, and it'll be interesting to see with Bryson. I mean, he's an interesting character, and he's very driven. You know, my personal belief, I think Bryson DeChambeau will be the number 1 player in the world at some point in his career. You know, his single-mindedness is why I would support that statement. And, you know, some people will call him quacky or a little bit quirky with some of the things that he does, but, you know, his goal is to be as good as he can be. And, you know, at this point in his career, he's not distracted by a family and kids and all the other things that we have in our life. He's very single-minded in his approach. And it's interesting. I mean, he's pushed the envelope in a direction that nobody's really kind of pushed, at least on purpose. And the results have been phenomenal. I mean, for him to be able to produce the speed that he does. Now, having said that, like I said to you before, you need to hit 50 yards further to have the same proximity out of the rough that you do in the fairway. So, will it pay off? You know, obviously, I think in some ways it already has. But for the length that Bryson hits it off the tee, so here's an interesting stat. For every yard that you hit the ball over 296 yards on a PGA Tour, you gain 0.04 of a shot, okay, on the field. So a very small amount. Now, Bryson hits it about 30-some-odd yards longer than tour average, up around 330 yards. So he gains somewhere around 1.2 or 1.3 shots per round because he's 30 yards longer on his average tee shot. Why don't you just make one more putt a day? You know what I'm saying? Like, for a lot of players, that's going to be a phenomenally bigger difference than a guy that gains 10 yards and he's gaining a third of a shot per day because he's gained 10 yards. Why don't you just putt better and make one more putt a day, you've gained a full shot. And
save your body in the process.
putting's not really sexy compared to obviously hitting the ball 350 yards. So, it's looking at those things a little bit. It always amazes me when Luke Donald was number one in the world. This is a guy that drove it kind of crooked, not very long, and he was the best player in the entire world because nobody wedged it and pitched it and putted better than Luke Donald did in his prime. So there's multiple ways of getting to be the best player in the world, and Bryson's, and this is his single-mindedness. He has improved his putting immensely over the last 2 seasons,
right?
As well as gotten longer. So he has gained in his putting and his driving, but nobody talks about his putting. They all talk about how far he's hitting the golf ball, right? And it's almost like a little bit of an illusion, right? He's a lot cagier than you think. Right? He's a lot smarter, because he distracts everybody with these 200-mile-an-hour ball speeds, and then he goes out and plays, and he's still really fast, but a lot of them are 190, 195. It tends to be more the on-course average. But he'll get these 205s and these crazy numbers on the range, and guys are looking at him going, oh my gosh, how do I compete with this guy? He hits it forever. But quietly, he's also improved and been one of the top 20 putters on the PGA Tour in the last 2 years. So he's sort of distracting you with the flash, if you will, and he's actually getting it done in other areas as well. And he's a smart guy. He knows what's up for sure. And then I said that I like watching him. I like his process because and I know Chris fairly well too. And there's a pursuit there, and they're doing everything in their power to be the best version of Bryson as he can be. And it's an interesting sort of little circus ride for sure.
Yeah, I agree that his single-mindedness is his. Of all the good things he has going for him, that's the thing that's going to propel him to be number one player in the world. And as you said, he's not distracted. If he falls in love next year and he gets married, not knocking marriage, but I mean that is a big life-changing thing. And now you're not the only one who you're responsible for. So at that level, it's pulling you in another direction. You've done a fair amount of work with tour pros, world-class players. Grant Waite, Mackenzie Hughes, I think is your top guy right now. How do you identify? And we kind of touched on it a little bit. What they need, and that fine line of them losing their game and going down to a deep hole. And that trust factor. How do you develop that in getting them to buying into what you're trying to get them to do without losing their game or losing what they might feel has got them there, and that's them figuring something out? How do you manage that in the player-coach relationship?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. You're constantly trying to bridge that, and at the end of the day, and Butch Harmon told me this one personally. He said, if you can make the player believe it's their idea, that's the best way to do it. So you convince them, you show them, you twist it around a little bit, and they think they've come up with it a little bit themselves. That's where you've got them, right? And that's where they're going to make that change, because at that level, I said it is definitely more collaborative. And as I said, they will do what you want to a point, but I said if the results aren't fairly tangible fairly quickly, and or it feels too bizarre or something like that, so they just won't do it. So there has to be a little bit of help there, and the other piece of advice Butch gave me was, find yourself the best players to work with. Because the best players are always going to win, whether they're 100% implementing your teachings or not. They're just really good. So obviously that's going to help you out because they're winning all the time. So if you look at Butch's track record, he doesn't typically work with the run-of-the-mill PGA Tour guys. He's working with Phil and DJ and guys that no matter what they do, they're going to win. They're just that good. And not to say that it certainly has an influence in very positive directions, but, you work with good players at the club level, right? Work with your club champions, work with your better players. That trickles down to the other membership. That they look at you and go, well, this guy trusts his game with this guy. Well, he's good enough for me then, right? And so it is a selling point. So that was a good piece of advice from Butch. But he did say, if you can make it, if you convince the tour players their idea, you've won that battle. And that's certainly hard to do. So I think in this day and age, like I was saying before, everything's stats driven so well that you can look at a player and then look at the stats and say, yeah, we're a little bit shy off in this area of it. Maybe we need to change. Or a lot of times for them, it's just changing their practice routine or changing their practice habits. So like we need to spend a little bit more time on short game and maybe a little less time on ball striking. The ball striking is really great right now. These last 5 tournaments, you're trending upward on the ball striking. We're trending downward on the short game. All right, let's pay attention to that the next couple of weeks, do a little bit extra work on the short game.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot easier to do on the PGA Tour. Now, when you're dealing with Corn Ferry players or mini tour players or so on, some of these other tours around the world, it's hard because you don't have that data. So now you're relying on the player to give you either stats or feedback of how they played. And sometimes that gets skewed, right? They'll tell you they're driving terrible, but they forget the fact they 3-putted 3 times.
Right.
Right? So it's like, well, yeah, that one drive cost you, for sure. It cost you a penalty stroke. But you 3-putted 3 times, and that cost you 3 strokes. So why aren't we dealing with that? Right? And so we want to make those decisions not sort of in a snap or an emotional state. We want to do it in an environment where we can look at it sort of in a cold and calculated way and say, yeah, these are the areas we need to do better in, and why do we think that is? And it could be, hey, I just threw a new driver in the bag. I'm not used to it. I'm not hitting it really great yet. The weight's a little bit different than my old driver, and I mean, there's a million reasons why the stats will change, and so we have to identify that. And sometimes it'll be, hey, just put the old driver back in your bag. Right? Like, let's save the new driver for the end of the season and maybe tweak it at that point. But right now, we got to make some cuts and make some money. So let's put the old driver back in the bag that we know that works really well for you.
As you've been in this business for 25 years and now you're seasoned, I'll call it, in that what I'm getting at is if a lot of coaches now have the X's and O's, meaning TrackMans and swing catalysts and the whole array of devices to measure, yet there are some coaches whose students seem to have some more success than others. Do you think it goes into your ability to coach the person and not so much just the X's and O's? And that comes from experience?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it's motivations, Sean Foley is a good friend and colleague and so on. And Sean is one of the most, successful motivators. In that respect, he's very much like Butch. He's very, very good at reading what the player needs at that given time. And sometimes they need a kick in the behind, and sometimes they need a little bit of, massaging the ego. And, Sean's very, very good at reading that situation. That's one of the reasons he's done very well for himself on the PGA Tour is his ability to read those situations really well. And, Sean's gotten better and better technically over the years, and I think that he's very, very much a very good technical coach now. When he first started on tour, he kind of had sort of one way that he looked at things, and now he's certainly more versatile. So he's grown and evolved on the technical side, but he's always had that ability to connect well with different individuals. And, players like Justin Rose and obviously, Hunter Mahan and some of these players that he's coached for some time, at least, or even on and off a little bit. I think he's done some great work with Lydia Ko. And
yeah, I agree. What he's done with Lydia is really been good for both of them.
Yeah, exactly. And some of it's certainly technical for sure, and their swings a little bit different than it was, and I think trending in a good direction. But also, I think it's about a lot of these players are carrying around baggage and being able to kind of clear out some of that baggage, if you will, and have some productive sessions. because you can teach somebody all the right things, but if they're not in the right mindset to accept it, it's going to be a tough session, right? And so sometimes, a great coach will say, we're done today. Let's go have lunch. We'll come back and we'll putt and chip afterwards, right? We just don't have it today. Right. And that takes somebody, who's really reading the situation well. And a lot of guys will say, nah, forget it. We're going to stay here until we get it. Right. And they're going to, that person just might not be, for a million different reasons, emotionally, mentally, just not really there. And as a result, if they're not available to you, then what's the point?
Right. You could end up getting them off on another tangent that now you got to bring them back from it. And then, as you talked about, when your time is such an important factor, especially at the tour level, you get them off on a tangent for a week, and now it takes a week to fix it, and now they're back on track the third week. You just lost 2 tournaments.
Right, exactly. So having, some great communication, and every relationship's different. Like, some of your tour players want to be your buddy and want you to be part of, a really close-knit part of the family. Other tour players want you to be a tool, like sort of your physiotherapist. I'm gonna call you when I need you, but stay away the rest of the time. And every relationship's different, and so kind of the rules of engagement is a good way to put it. Is they change constantly depending on the player that you're working with, and and that's why some coaches will connect well with players, and others maybe not so well. And it's not often, at a really high level. Sometimes the guys are teaching, let's say, very similar ideologies, but it's just the guy has a certain way of spinning it that connects well with the player, and obviously gets it done, and just making the changes. With Mackenzie, I've worked with Mackenzie since he was 15 years old. I've known him since he was a young man, and watched him sort of grow over the years. And myself and Derek Ingram, who's the national tour coach, and I've been in the picture for kind of 16 years or so, and Derek's been in the picture for 13 years or something like that, or even 14 years. So we both had influence in certainly his career. And at this point, I don't work a lot with Mackenzie. We do a little bit online from time to time, but he kind of knows his swing at this point. And Derek travels a little bit more because he works with Corey Connors on tour. So he's out on tour more than I am. So, if he has a problem, he works with Derek a little bit. And, Derek certainly understands the same tendencies. So at the end of the day, in some cases, like Mackenzie, you almost end up teaching yourself a little bit out of a job, right? Because you've gotten them to this point, and really they need a little bit of maintenance now again. But, he doesn't need to relearn his golf swing. He just needs to maintain it sometimes. So I sometimes get the call when it's not working. So, but but in the last year and a half, it's been tough, obviously, with COVID. Is normally I'd fly down, we'd spend a couple of days in Charlotte and kind of sort things out. But we've obviously had to do a little bit more online now and again. But I don't think I've seen a swing of Mackenzie's now since maybe March. So it's been a few months. And in that time, he's played some good tournaments and played some tournaments. But at this point in his career, he's the ringleader, right? And he'll call me when he needs me, and we'll do some work. And if he feels he has it, he'll kind of stay there. So I'm not kind of steering that ship anymore. Whereas when he was 15 and a college player and Canadian Tour and even Corn Ferry Tour, to a large extent, Derek and I were kind of steering the ship. Now it's kind of like he tells us when he needs us, and he's his own man.
Yeah, he's like the CEO of he's the CEO of Mackenzie Corporation, and he calls on you when he needs you.
Exactly, and that's a very healthy thing to do, because now all of a sudden he takes ownership over his career, right? He takes ownership over his game. So, there are periods of time where he has to work harder, and there's periods of time where, he's a fairly new father. He's got 2 young kids, and, he wants to spend time with them as well. And, it goes beyond, obviously, the golf. And that's something about Mackenzie in that relationship is understanding that family is an incredibly important part of his psyche. And, if that part is really good, then he tends to transfer that well into the golf course. So for some players like Bryson, maybe it's a distraction, but for Mackenzie, it's actually, a positive. So it's blending all those pieces, and it's kind of fun. I mean, there's times certainly I'd love to do a little bit more with him and sharpen a few things, but at the same time, he said it's, he kind of has to control that and tell us when it's time to do some work and when it's time to kind of lay back a bit.
That's I think that's probably some of the best advice and a clear illustration why I asked that of what goes beyond the X's and O's of a tour level coach. And for anyone out there who might not know and had always wondered, that you could not script a better answer than the one you just gave. Right? It's more about coach. It's more about just swing. It's more about the individual. What's best for them? What's going to make them play their best? And understanding that.
Yeah. And to be honest, there's been a lot of trial and error by both Derek and I over the last, 15 or 16 years. Like, it's not like we knew that from day one. I mean, we've all grown. We've all evolved. We've all, the relationship has changed, in terms of all those things. So we've learned to adapt, basically. And human beings change and evolve over time. And the needs that he had at 16, 17, 20 years old are very different than now that he's 30 years old. So, and we all learn because of that. So that's where I said, we bridge that gap. Obviously, we do a lot in terms of technical coaching and instruction, if you will, but the art of coaching is also understanding the player and that communication and what, some of the best lessons are when you don't say anything.
Right.
Right.
Yep. And you've got to learn how to know when to do that and when not to.
Right. And sometimes they need a little, a little tip or a little piece. And there's other times it's best just to, kind of shut up and let them work it out themselves. And, so it's this constant puzzle and it keeps changing. The background keeps changing and you've got to keep adapting, with your players. And, you don't get to a point you go, okay, we're done. Just go play now. You'll be great. It's just, it's just not that game. So, great coaches, or let's say longevity in coaching is sometimes tough. For some players, they're simply searchers. Charles Howell III is an incredible searcher. I mean, he's literally taken a golf lesson from just about every single coach.
Yeah, it seems like every time I see him on social media or YouTube or somebody, he's working with Grant. He's working with who was he? Someone before, I can't remember. Dana. He was working with Dana for a while. Then he's working with Grant. And wait a second, dude.
Well, Grant and Dana kind of split some coaching. So basically, if the players are on the East Coast, they work with Grant, and if they're on the West Coast, they work with Dana. So it's more of that, but they basically teach together. They're basically partners in that sort of deal with some of the players. But Charles is working with Andy Clemmer, at Stackington right now, or he has been. But he's just got a mentality that he's always trying to get better. So he's a searcher, and that's just in his DNA, if you will. That he's always, if he's not working at something, then he must not be getting better.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a little bit obviously that Tiger had as well, and that's just part of the way that his DNA is wired, if you will, or his psyche is wired to say to himself, "Hey, if you're not working on something, you're going backwards, not forwards." So
yeah, and if you mess with that gets to that delicate balance we talked about. You can't change somebody. I know people like Brandel, Chambly. Say if Tiger wouldn't have changed his swing, who knows how many times he would have won 30 plus majors. But it's like, okay, but you don't understand maybe his personality or what's driving that on the inside. He might have, if he would have tried to stick with that, maybe he doesn't have the career he does because something inside of him's eating away, right? We'll never know.
No, exactly. And obviously the career is remarkable in itself regardless. And it's like Nicklaus. You look at Nicklaus when he first came on tour, and they used to call him Fat Jack and everything else. I mean, his swing is completely different than the swing that he had in the 70s, which was completely different than the swing he had in '86 when he won the Masters.
Mm-hmm.
And people get older. Your flexibilities change. Your swing will change regardless of whether you try and change it or not. Simply because your flexibilities change and your strengths change and we get older and everything else. So we are constantly in a state of adaptation in a golf swing.
Yeah, there was a great post about Colin Montgomery's swing where he was kind of narrating or reviewing. I think they had earlier mid-'90s and then worked all the way through until the modern era. And it was really cool. And that's exactly what he said. He's like, I don't have as much thoracic mobility anymore, and I can't turn quite as much as I used to. The finish is still the same, but the backswing and the hand depth and all those other things is not anywhere near the same. He said, but I'm not the same person. I'm not the same body type. I'm not the same. Nothing's the same as it was 20 years ago. And that was pretty cool to see somebody post that.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's something that this is why we all need to continually work on our games, right? So all the listeners out there, I mean, you will always have to work on your game, whether you get to a certain level or not. There's going to always be a certain level of work you need just to maintain what you have. But because of the evolution of your body over time, and sometimes it's a positive evolution, sometimes a negative one, but, you're constantly going to have to make adjustments. And that's part of the fun, and honestly why I think, we play this silly game is that, part of it's for a very short period of time we think we might actually have it. And, certainly the golf gods don't like it when you think like that. And they kind of kick you in the teeth and take it all away, and you've got to rebuild it again. And everybody's, sort of game is in a bit of a state of flux. And we kind of touched on that earlier in terms of, just in terms of how players will make those changes and because they feel they need to. So, as you said, you have to know yourself, and some players are wired like that. Grant is wired like that. Grant has pursued many different themes and strategies for his own golf swing. And even as a coach, he's very well versed in multiple styles, even though he, was one of the Mac O'Grady disciples in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And a lot of what he does now is some of it's similar to what he did then, and some of it's quite different. His thoughts and theories as a coach have sort of shaped and changed some of the things that he does himself in his own game.
I try to tell some of the beginners or let's say 18 to 25 handicaps that let's say they want to break 100 for the first time and they're getting frustrated, and I will stop them at some time or when they come to me really worn out mentally, and I say, look, don't take this the wrong way, but that feeling you're having now, that anguish and everything, it doesn't ever change. In other words, you think if you could just get to this point, then you'll be happy or your game will be there forever, whether it's breaking 100, 90, 80, 70, or whatever the number is. I said, but it just, you're in a constant growth or you're in a constant spiral down. So continue with the growth.
We're always exactly. We're always chasing the carrot. The golf will always be a struggle. It's up to you whether it's a blind one or a guided one, right? So if it's guided and you understand what you need to do to get better, then that's a huge boon, because now you just have to put the work in and obviously get better. When it's a blind struggle, and in this day and age, because there's so much information out there, some of it's terrible, some of it's great. But one of my pet peeves is that there's no sort of order, if you will, in terms of the priority. What is the most important thing that you can do, right? For most golfers, it's going to be, hey, I need to make solid contact with a square face. That's still the priority. I mean, face control is 85% of your start line, roughly. You better have a systematic way of getting that club face reasonably back to a square position. So all of these other things, like ground reaction forces and like swing planes and shallow and steep and all these things in between. But the objective is I still got to get that club leaning forward on most of the shots off the ground with the face square. From there, you've got options in terms of path. Do I want to create a curve that goes right or a curve that goes left? But at the end of the day, I need that club face at a world-class level to get to within plus or minus 1.4, 1.5 degrees of tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're designing. So all of the things in your swing need to complement that one idea.
And unfortunately, when you look at tips on the internet and so on, is that there's no priority. It's like, well, if you get shallow, you'll be good.
Right.
Well, wait a minute. Right? Well, Nicholas wasn't shallow. Adam Scott's not shallow. They're pretty good at golf. So maybe that's not for everybody, right? I mean, that's an option. There's reasons why for a lot of players it's going to be very good. I'm not certainly poo-pooing that idea, but you get what I'm saying. But there's no priority. How is that going to change my face-to-pass relationship? You want to play world-class golf, you need that face-to-pass relationship consistently inside of 2 degrees, right? If you do that well, you're going to hit a lot of very straight shots that don't have a lot of curve, and you'll be able to manage your way around the golf course really well. As soon as the face-to-pass relationship gets to 4 degrees, now you're looking for golf balls. So
you're in trouble.
Absolutely. So it's literally that simple and at the same time that difficult. So all of the processes that you're putting into that swing are designed to narrow the gap between your face and path so you can play reasonably straightest golf. Or if I'm not playing straightest golf like Bubba, then I better have a pretty darn good control over all of those shots. And I'm going to work really hard at hitting a lot of different shots with a lot of different curves. That is getting to be a dying art, if you will. It's refreshing to see a guy like Bubba actually play like that. Because, I mean, that's how basically everybody played back in the day.
Mm-hmm. Especially with today's equipment where things aren't supposed to curve as much. It's built not to curve.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. And, so the bladder golf ball back in the day, certainly, spun basically, almost a third more than the modern golf ball. So you hit a full sand wedge shot now with a golf ball, you might get 10 to 11,000 RPM. With a bladder golf ball, you get 15,000 RPM.
Yeah, could you imagine? Remember back in the 80s and 90s that Greg Norman had so much trouble on back pins. He basically couldn't get to a back pin because he put so much spin on the ball. Could you imagine him with today's equipment?
Crazy. Yeah, he'd be pretty good. He would have won a few more majors, I'll tell you that, because, he'd back him right off the greens into the rough and, not get up and down and make silly bogeys because the ball spun too much.
I remember he went to the Tour Edition. That was one of the first harder balls, but still had some soft feel. But he still spun that off the green. Yeah.
Still spun it. I mean, just, the modern golf ball spins so little compared to the old one, and that's changed the way equipment's built. I mean, nothing's changed the swing. This is forced players to get out of sort of a laggy, trappy kind of a swing that everybody used to do because you needed to trap the ball and really flight it low because there was so much spin on the ball it would rise.
Mm-hmm.
So you get that low riser ball flight, which looked really cool. But now we look at it and go, yeah, it's a terrible ball flight if I'm trying to hit it far.
Right.
I want high launch, low spin instead of low launch, high spin. But it looked really cool because it looked like an F-15, taking off from the runway. So the whole generation of players learned to sort of lag trap it a little bit, if you will. And so everybody was taught to, sort of hold the angles and drive this thing. And well, now the golf ball doesn't spin. So you try and do that, you just hit it low, right? It's very difficult to hit it high enough. So swings have gotten wider. The arcs have gotten wider at the bottom. Players have less lag. Guys like DJ and Rory have less than 90 degrees of lag at P5 or halfway down. And it's a much, we'll call it a sweepier motion, if you will, in general, especially with the long clubs, than it used to be 30 years ago. And nothing's changed that more than the golf ball.
Do you find that you've had to change your teaching methods over the course of that time to adapt to the technology?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I'm going to say how old I am, I guess now, but I learned with a persimmon driver and a bladder golf ball. And
same here.
Average persimmon driver was a 13-degree loft because back in that day, you wanted to hit down on it. You actually wanted to hit down a couple of degrees because you wanted the launch angle to be about 8. So if you could launch it around 8, the ball launched at 8 and then spun up into the air, and that was the way that you kept it out of the wind. And, it didn't get murdered by the wind. So as time has gone by, right, we got 6-degree drivers, 8-degree drivers, all these low lofted drivers, as the weight further back, are launching the ball so much higher with less spin. And now we're looking at it saying, yeah, we want your wind to be 13 degrees with, 2,000 RPM spin on it. So, to accomplish that, absolutely a swing has had to change. So that's why you can't compare players in different eras, right? You can't say Hogan was better than Nicklaus, and Nicklaus is better than Tiger, or Tiger's better than everybody. I mean, it's just the equipment's different. The course setups are completely different. The field depth nowadays is insanely talented. Mm-hmm. You can't really compare and make those arguments because, you know, when someone says, hey, if Ben Hogan had today's equipment, he'd win every week. It's like, well, yeah, but the priorities of what you did are totally different, you know?
Yes, what he did from the time that he was a kid until the time he was an adult and playing, that you got to factor in all of those decades of
right, exactly.
slow, gradual development has changed.
Right. And it's fun to obviously just, you know, kind of kibitz about those arguments, but in reality, you really can't compare them because the rules of the game, the course setups, you know, they're playing, 7,800 yards at the PGA. I mean, it's just insane. So, you know, back in the day, you played 6,300. You know, that was a long golf course back in the 50s. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just, now, obviously, the equipment goes further now, but the requirements are totally different. Right?
I remember playing at Greensboro, and I think it's the third or fourth hole. Now, this was back in 2005. Before they did the remodel, there was a plate in the fairway. I want to say it was 138 yards. It said Byron Nelson holed out from here in the 1945 Greensboro Open with a 6-iron. 138 yards.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say, did they have that thing upside down? Are you sure it's not a 9-iron?
Well, yeah, but, you know, that's the other problem, too, is, right, his 6-iron probably has a loft of his 8-iron, mm-hmm. right? So it's sort of, then it goes, okay, well, maybe he was hitting an 8-iron, still kind of short by today's standards. But when you look at it and you go, okay, by the time the ball spun that much, it's just not going to go anywhere. So it's not, that's the other thing, too. As a whole, certainly today's players are better athletes and they're stronger and fitter as a whole. But having said it, there were still long hitters, obviously, in the day mm-hmm. as well. I mean, Palmer was a long hitter. Nicklaus was the longest hitter of his era. Obviously, Tiger was the longest hitter, too. You know, besides John Daly, he was the longest hitter. So, the game has always sort of chased a little bit of the player that was really good to hit it far. Because it's exciting, right, to watch somebody hit the ball, 350 yards or something. But, again, you look at Ben Crenshaw. He was kind of wild and crooked off the tee and phenomenal putter. And won 2 Masters because of it. So, just because you can't do one thing doesn't mean you can't play well. And if you get really good at some of the other pieces, you can make up for some of your sort of deficiencies. So it's interesting.
Absolutely. I could sit here. I mean, we've blown through almost 3 hours. I could sit here and talk to you another 3. If you were here, I'm sure we'd have a few bottles of empty wine sitting here, and we'd probably have many more.
That was exactly. Well, we did pound that one through when I did my last podcast at Jason's house. I think we got through a couple bottles, and it was kind of fun. But we'll have to do that certainly at some point. For sure. Do you want to finish off with a couple rapid fire?
Yeah, let's do some rapid fire. I call it the emergency 9 rapid fires. I'll go through the 9 real quick. I know your wife is probably going to hate me, and she's never even met me yet, and I don't want that to happen, taking up all your evening. So let's say that the first one, the last one, everybody gets. So let's say you got your game in really good shape. You qualified for the Canadian Open, won it, and played well, and you were a pick for the President's Cup. And okay. they started that first hole walk-up song. What would be your walk-up song to the first tee?
That's a great question. I like this one. I didn't know where you're going with this question. What would be? Oh, you know what? I'd play a nice solid Metallica song.
Yeah,
that'd be pretty good. Just to wake everybody up, just to kind of throw everybody for a loop.
That's a definite
nice.
90s era answer. The era exactly. You and I both grew up in.
Absolutely.
You're a voracious reader. What was the last book that you read?
Well, I read a lot of novels, but golf book. Actually, I'm reading a great book right now, authored by one of my friends called Surfing Rogue Waves, and it's about sort of the change in the world right now in terms of some of the things that we talk about, communication and things like that, and how
this is sort of a very interesting time in the world that will lead to a lot of change over the next 30 years. And we may see more and more and faster changes. So it's, a book by my friend Eric Pilon Bignell, and, it's really good. So Surfing Rogue Waves is the last book I'm kind of working my way through.
Cool. Sounds like I might have to check that one out. If you had to play one course the rest of your life, which one would it be?
Oh, it'd have to be Augusta. I mean, if I had my choice, it would have to be Augusta. Having been there, multiple times, and certainly, I got the chance to spend a few days with Mackenzie there in 2017, and sort of, go in the clubhouse and sort of absorb all that, and then the history and obviously all the rest of that was just really special. So obviously, if you could play that golf course every day, it would be pretty good.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I'm sure most people would pick that one, and there's so many that it's hard to have a wrong answer. There is no wrong answer. Let's see. Moving on. If you could have an emoji on your golf clubs stamped, what would it be?
Probably the poop emoji. Probably the poop emoji. No, yeah, it's, something like that. Yeah, it'd be sort of derogative for sure.
Cool. Would you rather be able to talk to all animals or all languages?
All animals or all languages, is that what you said?
Yep. You could speak every language on the planet, or you could talk to all animals. Which one would you choose?
I do all languages because the animals will just complain how they've been mistreated by the human race. So, that would be a pretty common theme. So I think I'd rather stick to talking to people.
Okay. Go-to drink on the golf course?
Well, the drink they serve at Augusta National is called a transfusion.
Yes,
okay?
that's
so
amazing.
Grape juice, and that would be the one. That was the first time I ever had it was at Augusta National, and certainly the nostalgia, if I have one of those, is certainly going to bring me back to Augusta. So transfusions, and if you throw a little vodka in it, becomes a confusion.
Yeah, I think I've had one too many of those a few times and gotten the confusion. If you could change one rule in golf, what would it be?
They've changed so many recently, to be honest with you. I'm a little afraid to tee it up in my experiment. All the dropping rules and,
no
and
kidding.
some of the things that used to be bad. The fact you can tap down spike marks and basically create your own lane. Like, I think they've actually gone too far. I actually like to bring them back a few.
Mm-hmm.
And, like the no practice swings and the hazard, I'm not a big fan of being able to do that. So I would actually go the other way. I wouldn't take a rule away. I'd actually maybe add some of the old ones back in.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm afraid to play in an event because I haven't played one 3 or 4 years, and I know I'm going to screw something up dropping the old way.
Yeah.
Let's see, 2 more.
Exactly.
Best ball striker you've ever seen?
In person,
Mm-hmm.
I would say that answer is actually probably 3. In person, certainly from where I am here in Hamilton, watching Mo Norman a little bit back in the day was always incredible, in terms of just the same ball flight, so straight over and over again. I mean, I don't think I've seen anybody ever do it quite that well. In terms of, on tour, I got a chance in 2012. I was coaching and caddying Mackenzie at the U.S. Open that Dustin Rose won at Marion. And, got to play actually, or Mackenzie played with Lee Westwood in one of the practice rounds. And he was incredible. Same little cut every single time. I mean, it's just unbelievable to watch. Now, at that time, he was suffering a little bit with the bunker play and the chipping and the putting a little bit, so that part was a little sketchy. But the ball striking was phenomenal. Also, probably Boo Weekley. Boo Weekley
Yes.
hits it really, really good.
I'll give you a quick story on Boo. The first year I played any mini tour stuff was in 2001, and that was the year he caught fire. I think he won 9 or 12 tournaments that summer on that mini tour, and that's the year he got his card for the first time. But we were at our we all got a membership at a club in Atlanta. They let us practice there and play when we were in town. And there was about 10 of us on the range one night, and we were all trying to hit this telephone pole at about 160 or 70 yards. And Boo got in a rhythm. I bet he hit that thing 6 out of 10 times.
Yeah,
He could, yeah, I was impressed. I mean, just the sound of the ball coming off his club, just the control. I mean, by today's standards, maybe a little bit lower ball flight, but I think it's why he plays so well at Hilton Head over the years. Is, you know, he's really good in the wind and so on. And obviously, he's been a little bit hot and cold with the putter over the years, but I mean, the ball striking is really, really quite impressive.
Yes, it is. I've seen it up close. And the last one, everyone gets this one as well. Greatest of all time player. And I usually throw in Tiger or Jack, but you can answer whoever you want to.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I really think Tiger, just in the respect that I mean, he's won with obviously so many different golf swings, so many different coaches, so many different variations of how he's won. And again, the single-mindedness and his amateur career and all wrapped up, I don't even think it's a question. I mean, no certainly offense or knock against Jack, but the depth of the field that Tiger tried to win at, the fact he was a plus 9.8 at one point in his career, I would have to give the nod to Tiger for sure.
No problem. It's a either or. I mean, not even either or. It's a very open-ended question. I don't even think there's a right or wrong answer. And I think Tiger has a slight edge in that as of late, but of the 50 episodes I've done, it might be something like 27-23 or 26-24. You know, just very close. So let everybody know you got your certified program. I'll have all the links to that in the description, the summary. But are you doing those anytime that someone can get online and register, or are you speaking anywhere that people can follow you, check you out some more?
Yeah, we'll have some stuff as the season goes by. I mean, here in Ontario, we're in lockdown until basically 2 weeks ago. So we just kind of opened the course. Everything's kind of gone gangbusters, obviously, on the course. So we're taking a little break from the online sort of certification stuff, probably until the fall. At that point, I've got some plans to travel to the U.S. as well as Europe and do some online, much heavier scale on the online stuff in the latter part of the year. So, but, you know, follow me on Instagram for sure and social media and Twitter and all the rest of that kind of stuff. And, you know, I generally post all that stuff up. So you can follow me and sort of get a schedule of upcoming events.
All right. And for everybody, I'll have Scott's handles for Instagram, Twitter, and anything else he's got out there. Just click on it. You can follow him. I highly recommend it. Obviously, you've got a great amount of knowledge about it, and you're not going to forget any of it anytime soon. It's only going to get better. I can't thank you enough for the time, Scott, and we'll have to do this again. I hope that I haven't taken too much time, like I said, irritated your missus, and she lets you come on my show again.
Absolutely. No, my pleasure, and I'd love to do it again, and hopefully next time we'll be able to do it in person, and maybe we'll. You're not too far from Jason, so maybe we'll make it a round table.
Yeah, we'll do a round table. Definitely, we'll have a little cookout and some wine and a whole bunch. We'll have a good time.
Perfect. Sounds good.
You have a great night.
All right. Thanks, Pete.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you enjoyed it, you can find more information on today's episode and other topics at golf360.blog. There you'll find the show notes and links related to this episode, as well as any other episode that we've done so far to date. If you're interested in improving your game and would like to learn more from yours truly by taking a private lesson, a half-day or multi-day school, club or putter fitting, you can reach me through the blog site or by email, pete@golf360.blog. So some of you may be asking, what is the golf paradigm? All you have to do is click on the homepage while on my blog site to discover how you can start playing better than you ever thought possible. Or you can simply sign up, again, on the blog page for my instructional videos where I give regular tips on all areas of the game to include the swing, club design and fitting, health, fitness and nutrition, the mental aspects, and equally as important, the integration of all those things together. I'm also on social media, and you can find me at The Golf Paradigm. That's PARADIGM, and I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, also under the same name, The Golf Paradigm. Facebook is usually the best way to reach me for questions and or comments, and I look forward to hearing what all of you have to say. This podcast is brought to you in part by Old South Golf Links. A short ride across a bridge from Hilton Head Island is one of the area's finest golf courses and a hidden treasure. Set up on towering pines and ancient oaks with sweeping marsh vistas, truly makes Old South Golf Links a one-of-a-kind golfing experience. The Clyde Johnson design was named one of the top 10 new public courses when it opened, and it also takes full advantage of the natural beauty of the Low Country. Old South is a fun and unique challenge for golfers of every skill level and a favorite of both locals and visitors. Whether it's your first time here or you're a regular, you'll be treated and feel like family. From the bag drop to check-in at the fully stocked pro shop with both men's and women's apparel, to breakfast or lunch before or after your round, the staff is always ready and willing to help. Experience for yourself why Old South is one of the premier golf courses in the Hilton Head area and why it will quickly become a favorite of yours too. Visit them in person or online at www.oldsouthgolf.com, or to make it tee time, simply call the pro shop at 843-785-5353.